Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the Victorian era, where death wasn't something hidden away in hospitals, it lived right there in your home, waiting in every mirror, every reflection, every piece of glass. Imagine this, your grandfather has just passed away in the bedroom upstairs. Before you can even begin to grieve, your mother is rushing through the house with black cloth in her arms, covering every single mirror, every window, every reflective surface. Why? Because she genuinely believes that if she doesn't, his soul might become trapped forever in the glass, unable to reach heaven, condemned to watch your family from inside the mirror for all eternity. This wasn't rare. This wasn't eccentric. In 1863, this was simply what you did when someone died. Now I know what you're thinking. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating world, I'd love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm sharing with you tonight. And I'm curious, where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed in Texas, sitting in a quiet room in London? Wherever you are, drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you're watching this. I love hearing from you. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step back in time together. The Victorian era, that's 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria, was absolutely obsessed with death. And I don't mean in a morbid, unhealthy way, I mean they lived with death as an intimate companion. Child mortality was staggeringly high. If you were born in the early Victorian period, especially in the 1830s and 40s, your chances of seeing your 40th birthday were about 50-50. Diseases we can cure with a simple prescription today, scarlet fever, tuberculosis, cholera, were death sentences. Mothers commonly lost 2, 3, sometimes 5 children before those children reached age 5. Death wasn't something that happened to other people. It happened to your family regularly, predictably, heartbreakingly. And so the Victorians developed an entire culture around death. Elaborate mourning rituals, specific clothing you had to wear for years, jet black jewellery made from a gemstone called jet, which was the only adornment a widow could wear, and superstitions, oh so many superstitions, designed to protect the living from death's grasp and to help the deceased find peace in whatever came next. The mirror superstition was perhaps the most universally practiced. When someone died in a Victorian home, and remember, people died at home back then, not in hospitals, the body would remain in the house for days. This was called the wake, and it served 2 purposes. First, it gave the family time to grieve together. Second, and this might sound shocking, it gave everyone time to make absolutely sure the person was truly dead and not simply in a deep coma. Yes, the fear of being buried alive was very, very real. They even invented safety coffins with bells you could ring from inside if you woke up 6 feet under. But that's a story for another time. During the wake, every mirror in the house had to be covered with heavy black cloth, usually black crepe, the same material used for mourning veils. This wasn't optional, this wasn't, oh, if you feel like it. This was as essential as closing the eyes of the deceased. And the reason? The Victorians believed that mirrors held a special, almost magical power. They called photographs mirrors with memories. They believed mirrors could capture something essential about a person, not just their physical image, but something deeper, what they called the shadow. Now, this word shadow meant something different to them than it does to us. When Victorian photographers used the advertising slogan, "Secure the shadow ere the substance fades," they weren't talking about literal shadows on the ground. They were talking about the soul, the essence, the spiritual imprint of a person. And they believed that when someone died, their shadow, their soul, was in a vulnerable state, confused, possibly lost, trying to find its way to the afterlife. A mirror, being a reflective surface, could trap that shadow. Imagine a moth drawn to a lamp, unable to resist the light. That's how they saw the relationship between a departed soul and a mirror. The soul might see its own reflection and become mesmerized, unable to look away, unable to move on. Days would pass. The funeral would happen. The body would be buried. But the soul? Still trapped in the hallway mirror, watching helplessly as the family moved on without it. Even more terrifying was another belief. If a living person looked into an uncovered mirror in a house where someone had just died, they might see the face of the deceased staring back at them instead of their own reflection. And if you saw yourself in that mirror, well, that was an omen that you would be the next to die. So you can understand why families were absolutely frantic to cover every reflective surface. It wasn't just about protecting the dead, it was about protecting themselves. There's documented account from 1879 of a family in Lancashire who forgot to cover one small mirror in the back hallway. A servant girl happened to glance into it the morning after the master of the house had died. She screamed that she had seen his face looking back at her, pale and ghastly. Within 3 weeks she had developed a fever and died. Now we can look back with our modern understanding and say she probably died of an infection or illness that was already incubating. But to that Victorian family, the mirror had claimed another victim. The story spread through the neighbourhood like wildfire, and you can bet that every mirror in every house was covered religiously after that. The practice of covering mirrors wasn't unique to Victorian England, which actually gave it more credibility in their eyes. Jewish families practicing Shiva, the 7-day mourning period, also cover mirrors. The Orthodox tradition explains this as preventing vanity during a time of mourning. You shouldn't be concerned with your appearance when someone has died. But there's also an older mystical explanation that mirrors can trap souls, remarkably similar to the Victorian belief. This cross-cultural similarity made Victorians feel their superstition had ancient universal wisdom behind it. But mirrors weren't the only household objects that had to be ritually handled when death visited. Clocks had to be stopped at the exact moment of death. Every single clock in the house. The tall grandfather clock in the hallway, the mantel clock in the parlour, the pocket watch in the deceased's vest. Everything stopped. Time itself had to pause to mark this significant moment. Why stop the clocks? The reasons were multiple and layered, as Victorian superstitions often were. On a practical level, stopping the clocks recorded the exact time of death for the official records. But the supernatural explanations were more compelling. Some believed that if the clocks kept ticking, they would tick away the life of another family member. The steady rhythm of time would somehow pull another soul toward death. Others believed it was deeply disrespectful to let time march on as if nothing had happened when someone's entire existence had just ended. Time should stop, at least symbolically, at least in this house, to honour the magnitude of what had just occurred. The clocks would remain stopped until after the funeral, after the burial, after the deceased had been properly laid to rest. Only then would the family carefully wind each clock and set it going again, allowing time to resume its normal flow. Some families even had a tradition of starting all the clocks at exactly the same moment, so that the house would come back to life all at once, in unison. It was a way of saying, grief has had its moment, now life must continue. Family photographs were another concern. Many Victorian families would turn all the framed photographs face down after a death. The belief here was slightly different from the mirror superstition. They worried that if the photographs remained facing outward, the spirit of the deceased might attempt to possess the people in those photographs, particularly if the deceased was in the photo themselves. Imagine a family portrait with mother, father, and 5 children. Father dies. If that portrait remains on the mantelpiece facing the room, father's confused spirit might try to enter the photograph, might try to reclaim his place in the family that way. Or worse, might try to pull one of the living family members out of their body and into the photograph with him. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone actually see these spirits in mirrors or photographs? Well, the Victorians certainly claimed to, but we have to remember that grief does extraordinary things to the human mind. When you've lost someone you love desperately, when you're exhausted from days of caring for a sick relative, when you're emotionally shattered, your mind can play tricks on you. You might glance at a mirror in dim candlelight and think, just for a second, that you saw a familiar face. You might look at a photograph and feel so strongly that the person is still present that it seems like their eyes are following you. The Victorians also had far less understanding of psychology than we do today. They didn't have concepts like grief hallucinations or trauma responses. If you saw something strange, it was supernatural. If you heard something odd, it was a spirit. There was no other explanation available to them. And in a society where everyone believed in these phenomena, where everyone expected to encounter the supernatural during a death, confirmation bias ran rampant. If you expected to see a ghost in the mirror, you were much more likely to interpret any shadow, any flicker of candlelight, as exactly that. But here's what's truly fascinating. The mirror-covering tradition served a genuine psychological purpose, even if the Victorian justification was supernatural. When you cover the mirrors during mourning, you're creating a physical space that feels different from normal life. You're making the house look and feel altered, which reflects the altered state of the family. You're removing vanity and self-reflection at a time when those things feel inappropriate. And practically speaking, you're sparing mourners the shock of catching their own grief-stricken reflection unexpectedly. Imagine stumbling to the bathroom at 3 a.m, devastated by loss, and suddenly seeing your own haggard face in the mirror. It could be genuinely distressing. So even though we don't believe mirrors trap souls anymore, even though we understand that reflections are simply light bouncing off surfaces, there was a strange wisdom in this superstition. It created boundaries around grief. It made death feel sacred and set apart. It gave people specific actions to take when they felt helpless in the face of loss. The black cloth would eventually come down, usually about a week after the funeral. The mirrors would be unveiled in a small, quiet ceremony. Sometimes a prayer would be said. Sometimes family members would simply nod to each other that it was time, and life, slowly, painfully, would begin to return to normal. The clocks ticked again. The mirrors reflected the living once more. But the memory of those draped surfaces, those stopped clocks, would remain as a reminder of how close death had come, how thin the veil was between this world and the next. And this was just the beginning of Victorian death superstitions. Because if they believed mirrors could trap souls, you can only imagine what they believed about other household objects, other daily activities, other seemingly innocent actions that might accidentally summon death to your door. Which brings us to another superstition, one that might seem even stranger than covered mirrors, one that involved a very specific piece of furniture and a number that still makes people nervous today. Because the Victorians didn't just fear death in their mirrors, they feared it at their dinner tables. And if you had exactly the wrong number of guests at supper, well, you might have just invited death to pull up a chair and join you for the meal. But that's where we'll continue our journey next time. For now, rest easy knowing that in your modern home you can look in all the mirrors you want. No souls are trapped there, at least probably not. Sweet dreams, everyone. Picture this, it's a chilly evening in October of 1868. You're a respectable middle-class Victorian hosting a dinner party at your London townhouse. The cook has prepared a beautiful roast. The table is set with your finest china. Your guests are arriving, shaking off the fog from their coats. 10 people, 11, 12, and then your heart sinks as you realize your brother has brought his wife unexpectedly. 13 people at your dinner table. The room goes quiet. Not because anyone is rude, but because everyone is counting. Everyone knows what this means. According to Victorian superstition, a belief so powerful that it could stop a dinner party cold, If 13 people sit down to dine together, one of them will die before the year is out. Not might die, will die. It's a death sentence, delivered by simple mathematics. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask, have you ever worried about the number 13? Maybe avoided the 13th floor of a hotel or felt a little uneasy on Friday the 13th? Drop a comment and let me know, because this Victorian fear is still with us today, lurking in the back of our minds. And once you hear where it came from, you'll understand why it was so terrifying. The origin of this superstition goes back almost 2,000 years to the most famous dinner party in history, the Last Supper. Jesus Christ and his 12 apostles gathered in that upper room in Jerusalem, 13 people at the table, and we all know what happened next. Judas Iscariot, the 13th guest to sit down, betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Within hours, Jesus was arrested. Within days, he was crucified. Judas, overcome with guilt, hanged himself shortly after. 2 deaths, both directly connected to that dinner of 13. For medieval and Victorian Christians, this wasn't just a story. It was a warning carved into the very foundation of their faith. The number 13 became inextricably linked with betrayal and death. It was literally the number of damnation. But there's more to it than just the Last Supper. The number 13 sits in this uncomfortable position between 2 sacred numbers. 12 is holy, 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 months in a year, 12 hours on the clock. 12 represents completeness, divine order, the way God organized the universe. And 14? Well, 14 is twice 7, and 7 is perhaps the most sacred number in Judaism and Christianity. 7 days of creation, 7 sacraments, 7 virtues, 7 seals in the book of Revelation. 13 is the awkward, unwanted stepchild wedged between these 2 blessed numbers. It's 1 too many for divine perfection, 1 too few for doubled holiness. It's the number that doesn't belong, the number that breaks the pattern. No wonder the Victorians saw it as cursed. And then there's Friday the 13th, which multiplies the fear exponentially. Friday is the day Christ was crucified, already a day of sorrow and death in the Christian calendar. Combine that with the cursed number 13, and you have what Victorians considered the unluckiest day possible. Some Victorian families wouldn't leave their houses on Friday the 13th. Businesses would close. Important decisions would be postponed. Even today, economists estimate that hundreds of millions of dollars are lost every Friday the 13th because people avoid flying, avoid major purchases, avoid taking risks. But back to our dinner party dilemma. You've got 13 people in your dining room, and everyone is acutely aware of what this means. The superstition isn't just that bad luck will befall the group, it's far more specific and sinister than that. The first person to rise from the table after the meal will be the one who dies. Imagine the psychological torture of that belief. You've just enjoyed a lovely roast and some wine, the conversation has been delightful, and now you need to excuse yourself to use the facilities or to check on the children upstairs. But if you stand up first, you've just sealed your fate. Can you picture the awkwardness, everyone sitting frozen at the table, desperate for the dinner to end but terrified to be the first to move, glancing at each other nervously, taking tiny sips of port that they don't really want, making small talk that grows increasingly strained, until finally some brave or foolish soul would stand and a collective gasp would run through the room. Some guests might immediately make the sign of the cross, others might touch wood or cross their fingers, and everyone would watch that person carefully over the coming months, waiting to see if the superstition would prove true. And here's the truly insidious part: confirmation bias. The Victorians would absolutely remember if someone died after being the first to rise from a dinner of 13. That story would be told and retold, growing in detail with each repetition, becoming proof positive that the superstition was real. But all the dinners where 13 people ate together and no one died. those were conveniently forgotten, dismissed as statistical flukes, or rationalized away with explanations like, "Oh, but someone crossed their fingers so the curse was broken." There are documented cases of this superstition causing genuine social crises. In 1876, a prominent London banker was hosting a business dinner when he realized at the last moment that he had 13 guests. He was so distressed that he offered his butler an enormous sum, equivalent to about $300 today, to sit at the table as the 14th person. The butler, who was probably thrilled to eat the master's food and get paid handsomely for it, agreed. Crisis averted. Other families kept a list of trusted friends or relatives they could summon on short notice to be the 14th guest. Imagine getting a frantic message, "Please come immediately, we're one short for dinner." And the wealthy had an even more elegant solution. They would hire professional 14th guests. Yes, this was an actual job in Victorian London. You could be paid to show up at fancy houses, sit quietly, eat well, and make sure no one at the table had to die that year. Some enterprising hosts tried different tactics. They'd set an extra place at the table and declare it was for an absent friend's spirit, hoping that would count as 14. Or they'd seat a child at a separate small table nearby, technically making them part of the dinner party but not actually at the cursed table. The mental gymnastics people performed to avoid this superstition were remarkable. Napoleon III, Emperor of France from 1852 to 1870, was reportedly obsessed with this superstition. He had witnessed too many coincidences, though whether they were truly coincidences or self-fulfilling prophecies, we'll never know. He insisted that every state dinner have at least 14 guests, and if they fell short, he would include servants in the count. For someone with that much power, that much confidence in his imperial destiny, to be terrified of a dinner arrangement tells you just how deeply this belief had penetrated European culture. The superstition became so prevalent that it affected architecture and business. When hotels began building upward in the late Victorian era, many skipped the 13th floor entirely. The elevators would go from 12 to 14, as if pretending 13 didn't exist would somehow neutralize its power. This practice continues today. Go into almost any hotel built before 1960, and you'll find no 13th floor. The rooms are there, of course, but they're labelled as floor 14. As if death can be fooled by creative numbering. Airlines followed suit. Many don't have a row 13. Some don't have row 17 either, because in Italian culture, 17 is the unlucky number. It's fascinating how these superstitions, born in the dining rooms of Victorian England, spread through the architecture and infrastructure of the modern world. But here's what I find most interesting about the 13 at dinner superstition. It reveals a deep psychological truth about how humans deal with mortality. We desperately want to believe that death is predictable, that it follows rules, that we can avoid it if we're just careful enough. The idea that you could randomly die, struck by disease, kicked by a horse, infected by contaminated water, was terrifying to the Victorians. But if death followed patterns, if it announced itself through omens like the number 13, then you could protect yourself. You could control it, at least a little bit. So they watched for the signs. They counted heads at dinner parties. They made elaborate plans to avoid cursed numbers. And when someone did die after attending a dinner of 13, it provided cold comfort. See, the universe has rules. Death isn't random. We just have to learn the rules and follow them. Of course, we know now that death doesn't care how many people are at your dinner table. Disease doesn't count chairs before deciding who to infect. But understanding the medical reality of Victorian-era death, the constant presence of tuberculosis, the contaminated water supplies, the complete lack of antibiotics, helps us understand why they so desperately needed to believe in patterns and omens. When you're likely to lose multiple children, when your spouse might suddenly develop a fever and be dead in 3 days, When your own life expectancy is barely 40 years, you grasp at any sense of control you can find. There was even a movement to fight back against this superstition. In 1880, a group of rationalists in New York City founded something called the 13 Club. They deliberately held dinners with exactly 13 members on the 13th day of every month, and they made a point of being the first to rise from the table, thumbing their noses at the old superstition. The club included 5 former United States presidents as members: Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt all dined at tables of 13 to prove the superstition was nonsense. And you know what? They didn't all drop dead. McKinley was assassinated, but that had nothing to do with dinner parties and everything to do with an anarchist with a gun. The rest lived to decent ages by Victorian standards. The 13 Club's existence and its prestigious membership should have been enough to kill the superstition, but it didn't. Because superstitions don't die easily. They're remarkably resilient, especially when they tap into our primal fears. Even today, even in our scientifically advanced world, many people still feel a small flutter of anxiety around the number 13. We know it's irrational. We know there's no mechanism by which a number could cause death. But that little voice in the back of our minds, the voice that echoes centuries of conditioning, still whispers, maybe be careful. Maybe don't tempt fate, maybe count the chairs before you sit down. And that's the real power of Victorian superstitions. They weren't just quirky beliefs that people abandoned once they learned better. They were emotional responses to mortality, fear given shape and rules, and emotions are far more durable than facts. So the next time you're at a dinner party and someone jokes about counting heads, or you're in an elevator that skips from floor 12 to floor 14, you'll know you're standing in the shadow of Victorian fear. A fear so powerful that it literally reshaped our buildings and still whispers in our minds more than a century later. But dinner parties and numbers weren't the only sources of Victorian death omens. Oh no. Because while they were carefully counting chairs, they were also creating something far stranger, far more intimate, far more unsettling. They were taking photographs of the dead, posing them as if they were still alive, and treasuring those images as the most precious possessions a family could own. And the reasons why, well, those might surprise you even more than cursed dinner parties. There's a photograph that haunts me. It sits in the archives of a museum in Massachusetts, taken sometime around 1865. A young mother in a dark Victorian dress sits in an ornate chair, her face peaceful, almost serene. In her arms, she cradles an infant dressed in white christening gowns, the baby's eyes closed as if sleeping. The family dog sits obediently at her feet. Behind them, a father stands with his hand on the mother's shoulder. It looks like a typical Victorian family portrait. Except for one chilling detail, the baby is dead. This photograph was taken after the child had passed away, and the entire elaborate scene, the posing, the lighting, the careful arrangement, was designed to create one final image of their child that they could keep forever. Welcome to the world of postmortem photography, one of the most misunderstood and yet most touching superstitions of the Victorian era. And yes, I'm calling it a superstition because the Victorians believed something profound about these photographs. They believed they were capturing more than just an image. They believed they were securing the shadow, the very essence, the soul, before the substance of the body faded away. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Do you have photographs of your loved ones on your phone right now? Your parents, your children, your friends? How many photos do you have? Hundreds, thousands? We live in a world where capturing someone's image is effortless, instant, infinite. But imagine living in a time when you might never have a single photograph of someone you loved. Not one. That was the reality for most people in the early Victorian era. And when photography finally became available, it was expensive, time-consuming and rare. For many families, especially the working class, a post-mortem photograph might be the only image they would ever have of their child. Let me ask you, if that were your reality, would you take that photograph? The story of post-mortem photography begins in 1839, when a Frenchman named Louis Daguerre invented the daguerreotype, the first practical photographic process. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, you could capture someone's exact likeness in minutes rather than the hours or days it took a painter. The technology spread rapidly, reaching England and America by the early 1840s, and almost immediately people began photographing their dead. This wasn't morbid, this wasn't ghoulish, this was love expressed in the only permanent way available. You have to understand the Victorian relationship with death to understand why these photographs made sense to them. Death happened at home. You didn't call an ambulance to rush someone to a hospital. You didn't have intensive care units or life support machines. People died in their own beds, surrounded by their families, after days or sometimes weeks of visible decline. The family would wash the body themselves. They would dress it in its finest clothes. They would sit with it for days during the wake. Death was intimate, familiar, ever-present. Child mortality was staggeringly high. In 1840, 4 out of every 10 children born in English cities died before their 5th birthday. 4 out of 10. Diseases we can cure with a simple prescription today, scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, were death sentences. Many families lost multiple children. A mother might give birth to 8 or 9 children and watch half of them die before they learn to read. The grief was unimaginable, constant, expected. So when photographers began advertising their services, they used a slogan that perfectly captured the urgency and the superstition of the era. Secure the shadow ere the substance fades. Think about that phrase for a moment. The shadow. They didn't say capture the image or take a picture. They said secure the shadow, because they truly believed that the photograph contained something more than just reflected light on a chemical plate. It contained the shadow, the spiritual imprint, the essential self of the person. Ere the substance fades, before the body decays, before the physical form returns to dust, before all evidence of this person's existence disappears from the earth. There was desperation in that slogan, but also hope. Hope that love could be stronger than death, that memory could be preserved beyond the grave, that this person who had lived and breathed and mattered could be secured forever. Photographers became experts in post-mortem portraiture. It was a significant part of their business, especially in the 1850s and 60s when the practice peaked. They had to be part artist, part psychologist, part mourning counsellor. They would arrive at the family's home with their heavy equipment, the camera, the glass plates, the chemical baths, all of it weighing 50 pounds or more, and set up in the parlour or the bedroom where the deceased lay. The goal was to make the dead look peaceful, dignified, and as lifelike as possible. For infants and young children, who made up the majority of post-mortem photographs, they would often be posed as if sleeping, arranged in a crib with a favourite toy, held in their mother's arms, the mother's face stricken with grief, but the baby looking serene. Sometimes they would prop the child's eyes open and paint pupils onto the photograph later, so the child appeared to be looking at the camera. Other times they would arrange the entire family around the deceased, creating what was called a mourning tableau, a final family portrait that acknowledged the loss while celebrating the life that had been. These photographs were expensive. A daguerreotype in 1850 might cost 50 cents to $2, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that 50 cents was half a week's wages for a labourer. A family might save for months to afford a post-mortem photograph, but they did it because these images were precious beyond measure. They were called mirrors with memories, and families would display them proudly in their parlours, often in special lidded frames along with a lock of the deceased's hair or a small memento. There's a quote that breaks my heart every time I read it. It's from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the famous poet, writing to her friend Mary Russell Mitford in 1843. She had just received a daguerreotype of a deceased loved one, and she wrote, "I long to have such a memorial of every being dear to me in the world. It is not merely the likeness that is precious in such cases, but the association and the sense of nearness involved in the thing, the fact of the very shadow of the person lying there forever. I would rather have such a memorial of one I dearly loved than the noblest artist's work ever produced. The very shadow of the person lying there forever." She understood what the photographers were selling. Not just an image, but a shadow, a presence. A way to keep the dead close. Now, I need to address something because there's a persistent myth about Victorian postmortem photography that simply won't die despite being completely false. You've probably seen the images circulating online. Victorian photographs with people standing stiffly and captions claiming these are dead people who've been propped up using special stands, their eyes painted open, their bodies manipulated by the photographer to make them appear alive. It's become a viral belief. Did you know Victorians posed their dead standing up? Here's the truth. They didn't, not ever. Those special stands you see in some old photographs, those were posing stands for living people. Photography in the 1840s and 50s required exposure times of 30 seconds to several minutes. Living subjects had to stay absolutely still or the image would blur. The stands helped steady them, often with a clamp that gently held the back of the head. But by the 1860s, when post-mortem photography was most popular, exposure times had dropped to just a few seconds. No stands were needed, and here's the simple, obvious reason why Victorians never propped up corpses: rigor mortis. A body becomes stiff within hours of death, and that stiffness lasts for days. You physically cannot pose a body in rigor mortis to look natural standing up. The joints don't bend properly. The muscles are locked. It would look obviously wrong, obviously artificial. The Victorians weren't trying to pretend their loved ones were alive. They were trying to create a beautiful, peaceful, dignified final portrait. There's a massive difference. The photographs that people mistake for standing corpses are actually living people who look a bit stiff because they were, well, holding still for the camera. Often they look pale or have slightly odd expressions because early photographic chemicals rendered skin tones strangely, and people weren't used to being photographed yet. They didn't know how to relax in front of a camera the way we do now. But even though the standing corpse myth is false, the real post-mortem photographs are still deeply affecting because they reveal something true about how the Victorians dealt with grief. They didn't hide from death. They didn't sanitize it or push it away. They sat with it. They memorialized it. They acknowledged that this person had lived and mattered and would be missed. As photography technology improved and became cheaper, the style of post-mortem photos changed. By the 1880s and 90s, it became more common to photograph the deceased in their coffin, surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements, with the coffin positioned in the front parlour. These photos focused more on the funeral itself rather than trying to make the deceased look lifelike. And gradually, as photography became ubiquitous and families could afford to take pictures of their children while they were alive, the need for post-mortem photography decreased. By the early 1900s, the practice had largely died out in middle-class families, though it continued longer in rural areas and among the poor. The last gasp of the tradition was the casket photo, where mourners would be photographed standing around the open casket at the funeral. You can still find these occasionally as late as the 1930s and 40s, though by then it was considered old-fashioned. But here's what fascinates me. We still practice a form of post-mortem photography today. We've just moved it into a different context. When someone is dying in a hospital, many families will take photos in those final days. Selfies with grandma in her hospital bed. Last photos with dad before he slips into unconsciousness. We do it for exactly the same reason the Victorians did. Because we need to secure the shadow before the substance fades. We need proof that this person existed, that we were together, that this love was real. And in some cultures, post-mortem photography never really went away. In parts of Latin America, in some Eastern European communities, in certain religious traditions, photographing the deceased is still normal and expected. The Victorian practice didn't disappear. It just went underground in mainstream Western culture, becoming something we do privately rather than publicly. There's something both heartbreaking and beautiful about these Victorian photographs. Yes, they can be unsettling to look at with modern eyes. Yes, it feels strange to see a mother holding her dead child as if the baby were merely sleeping. But underneath that strangeness is a universal human need, to hold on to the people we love for just a little bit longer, to have something tangible we can look at when the memories start to fade, to prove that this person, this life mattered. The Victorians believed they were securing shadows. We might use different words, capturing memories, preserving moments, keeping them close, but we're doing exactly the same thing. Death will always be with us. Grief will always be with us. And the desire to somehow, some way, keep our loved ones from disappearing completely, that will be with us too, no matter how much technology changes or how much time passes. But shadows and photographs weren't the only things Victorians believed could capture or ward off supernatural forces, because while they were carefully posing their deceased loved ones for one last portrait, they were also throwing things over their shoulders, avoiding certain animals, and performing small rituals at their dinner tables, all in the desperate hope that they could somehow keep death at bay, or at least understand its patterns. And one of the simplest, strangest rituals involved nothing more than a common kitchen ingredient and a quick flick of the wrist over your left shoulder. You're having dinner at a friend's house. Someone reaches for the salt shaker, knocks it over, and suddenly there's a cascade of white crystals across the tablecloth. And before anyone can even grab a napkin, your friend has scooped up a pinch of that spilled salt and thrown it over their left shoulder with their right hand, all in one smooth, practiced motion. You've probably seen someone do this, right? Maybe you've even done it yourself without really thinking about why. Well, let me tell you a story about why this peculiar habit exists, and I promise you it involves medieval Christianity, the devil himself, and one of the most persistent superstitions ever to survive into the modern age. The Victorians were absolutely convinced, and I mean genuinely deeply convinced, that Satan stood at every person's left shoulder, just slightly behind you, waiting for an opportunity to cause mischief or claim your soul. This wasn't a metaphor, this wasn't poetry. They believed the actual devil, or at least one of his demons, was physically positioned there at your left side, lurking in your peripheral vision, ready to pounce the moment you made a mistake. Now, where did this peculiar belief come from? It goes back to medieval Christian theology and the Bible itself. In Christian tradition, God sits at the right hand of power. You'll hear this phrase in churches even today. The right side is the side of righteousness, of divine favor, of angels and blessings. But the left side, that's where Satan was cast down to after his rebellion. The left is sinister, and yes, that's where we get the word sinister from. It literally means left in Latin. The left is unlucky, unholy, the realm of evil. So when you spilled salt, which happened frequently in households where salt cellars were open containers and not the shakers we have today, you were committing a small sin of waste and carelessness. And in that moment of your mistake, Satan was right there at your left shoulder, ready to take advantage of your misfortune and bring even more bad luck into your life. Maybe you'd spill something else. Maybe you'd have an argument with your spouse. Maybe you'd get sick. Satan was opportunistic like that. But here's where the genius of the superstition comes in. If you immediately took a pinch of that spilled salt and threw it over your left shoulder, you would hit Satan directly in the eyes. Salt burning and stinging would temporarily blind him, and in his confusion and pain he'd be distracted from cursing you. You'd have broken the chain of bad luck before it could really get started. It's actually kind of brilliant when you think about it. A simple, immediate physical action that gave people a sense of control over supernatural forces. The Victorians particularly loved this superstition because it had multiple layers of meaning. First, there was the Christian theological layer we just discussed, but there was also the historical value of salt itself. Throughout human history, salt has been precious. Before refrigeration, salt was the only way to preserve meat and fish for the winter. Empires rose and fell based on who controlled salt deposits. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. That's where we get the word salary from the Latin word for salt. Salt was literally worth its weight in silver in some time periods. So spilling salt wasn't just a clumsy accident. It was wasting something valuable, something that might mean the difference between your family eating well or going hungry. The superstition about throwing it over your shoulder may have started partly as a way to make people more careful with this precious commodity. If you believed bad luck would follow spilled salt, unless you performed a ritual, you'd be a lot more careful not to spill it in the first place. There's also a fascinating connection to Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting The Last Supper, which was completed in 1498, but became even more culturally influential during the Victorian period when reproductions became widely available. In the painting, if you look carefully at the figure of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would betray Jesus, you'll see that he's knocked over a salt cellar on the table. Da Vinci put it there deliberately. Spilled salt equals betrayal equals death. The Victorians, who studied this painting obsessively, would have absorbed this symbolism completely. Now let's talk about the specific technique, because there are rules to this. Oh yes, you must use your right hand, the righteous hand, the hand of God, to pick up the salt, and you must throw it over your left shoulder, Satan's territory. Throwing it over your right shoulder does nothing. That's where your guardian angel stands, and why would you want to blind your guardian angel? That would be counterproductive. And you must use the same salt that's spilled. You can't just grab the salt shaker and throw fresh salt. It has to be the tainted salt, the salt that's already touched by bad luck. Some Victorian families had additional rules. The salt had to be thrown within 3 seconds of spilling. Satan doesn't wait around after all. Some believed you had to close your eyes while throwing it, trusting in God to guide your aim. Others insisted you had to say a quick prayer, "Behind me, Satan," or simply, "Get thee behind me." The variations were endless, but the core principle remained: salt over the left shoulder as quickly as possible to ward off evil. And people took this seriously. There are documented accounts from the 1870s of dinner parties that descended into genuine panic when someone spilled salt and there was no salt remaining to throw. Maybe the cellar was empty, or the spilled salt had scattered too far to gather. Guests would become genuinely anxious, worried that bad luck would now plague the household. Some families kept a small dish of extra salt nearby just in case, like a spiritual first aid kit. The superstition was so widespread that it appears in literature, art, and popular sayings of the era. In 1879, one of the most common Victorian phrases was "help to salt, help to sorrow," meaning if you passed the salt shaker directly to another person, instead of setting it down on the table for them to pick up themselves, you were helping to pass sorrow along with it. The salt had to touch the table first, breaking the direct connection between people, or bad luck would flow from hand to hand like an infection. Think about how this must have complicated everyday dining. You're eating dinner, someone asked for the salt, and you have to remember, don't hand it to them, set it down, they'll pick it up, and heaven forbid you knock it over in the process. The Victorian dinner table was a minefield of potential supernatural catastrophes, But here's what I find genuinely interesting about this superstition. It reveals how the Victorians thought about evil and misfortune. They didn't see bad luck as random or meaningless. They saw it as an active force, a personality, literally Satan himself, who could be fought against with the right tools and knowledge. Spilling salt wasn't just an oops moment. It was a breach in your spiritual defenses, and you had to close that breach immediately. This is very different from how we think about luck today. We might say, oh, that's unlucky, when something goes wrong, but we don't really believe there's an entity causing it. We understand randomness, chaos theory, the fact that sometimes things just happen. But the Victorians couldn't accept that. They needed their misfortunes to have meaning, to have source, and therefore to have solutions. And you know what? There's something almost comforting about that worldview, even if we know it's not literally true. If Satan causes your bad luck, then you can fight Satan. But if bad things happen randomly for no reason, with no pattern, that's much more terrifying. You're completely helpless. At least with the salt-throwing ritual you could do something. You had agency. You had a weapon. Even if that weapon was just a pinch of sodium chloride thrown in the general direction of an imaginary demon. The salt superstition also connects to dozens of other salt-related beliefs the Victorians held. Salt couldn't be borrowed. If your neighbour asked to borrow some salt, you had to give it to them as a gift, never as a loan, or it would bring bad luck to both households. An empty salt cellar on the table was a terrible omen, suggesting poverty or death would come to the home. Some families believed that salt placed on a dead person's chest would prevent the devil from claiming their soul, which is why you'd sometimes find a small dish of salt in coffins. There were protective uses of salt too. Salt lines across doorways were thought to keep evil spirits out. They couldn't cross the purifying barrier. Some Victorian households would put a pinch of salt in each corner of a new room to bless it and drive out any lingering negative energy. Salt in a baby's baptism water was seen as extra protection against demonic influence. The Catholics had an entire ritual called the Salt of Wisdom that was part of baptism until the 1960s, where blessed salt was placed on an infant's lips. So salt wasn't just a seasoning to the Victorians, it was a spiritual tool, a weapon against darkness, a symbol of purity and preservation that worked on both physical and supernatural levels. When you spilled it, you weren't just making a mess, you were spilling your spiritual ammunition. And amazingly, incredibly, this superstition is still with us. I would bet that at least half of you watching this have either thrown salt over your shoulder yourself or have seen someone do it in the last year. Maybe at a restaurant, maybe at a family gathering. The practice has survived more than 500 years of Christian tradition, survived the Age of Enlightenment, survived the Scientific Revolution, survived the Victorian era and the 20th century, and made it all the way to our modern, supposedly rational age. Why? Because it's quick, it's easy, it doesn't hurt anyone. And on some level, even if we don't believe in Satan standing at our left shoulder, we still think, well, it couldn't hurt, could it? Just in case, just to be safe. That little voice in the back of our minds, the voice that echoes centuries of our ancestors' fears, whispers, throw the salt, you'll feel better. And you know what? We do feel better. Not because we've actually blinded any demons, but because we've performed a ritual that connects us to countless generations before us, because we've taken action instead of sitting passively with our mistake, because we've transformed a moment of clumsiness into a moment of tradition. That's the real power of superstitions like this one. Not that they work in any literal sense, but that they give us a script to follow when things go wrong, a way to feel like we're doing something meaningful even in the face of meaningless accidents. But salt and Satan weren't the only supernatural concerns that governed everyday Victorian life, because while they were carefully managing their salt cellars and watching their shoulders for demons, they were also dealing with an explosion of a different kind of supernatural belief, one that would become so popular, so all-consuming that even Queen Victoria herself would become a devoted follower. They weren't just fighting evil anymore, they were inviting the dead to tea, gathering around tables in darkened rooms, and trying to make contact with the world beyond. The spiritualist movement was about to take Victorian society by storm, and what happened in those séance rooms was far stranger than any salt-throwing ritual. Imagine walking into a Victorian parlour on a cold March evening in 1865. The curtains are drawn, the gaslight has been turned down to a dim, flickering glow, and seated around a circular table are 8 people, respectable, educated, middle-class Victorians, holding hands in absolute silence. At the head of the table sits a woman in her 30s, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. And then, without warning, the table begins to move. Not a little tremor, the entire heavy mahogany table lifts slightly off the floor and tips to one side. Someone gasps. The medium's eyes snap open, and in a voice that isn't quite her own, she says, "The spirits are with us tonight." This isn't a scene from a Gothic novel. This is real life in Victorian England, where communicating with the dead became not just accepted, but fashionable, where the boundaries between the living and the deceased were treated as permeable as silk curtains, and where even Queen Victoria herself employed a personal medium for 30 years. Welcome to the spiritualist movement, perhaps the strangest mass phenomenon of the entire Victorian era. And it all began with 2 teenage girls in upstate New York and a very simple code: knock once for yes, twice for no. The date was April 1st, 1848. The place was Hydesville, New York, a tiny hamlet that would soon become famous worldwide. 2 sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, ages 14 and 11, claimed they had made contact with the ghost of a man who had been murdered in their house years before their family moved in. The spirit communicated through rapping sounds, loud, deliberate knocks that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the furniture itself. Now, April 1st is April Fool's Day, which adds a certain irony to the whole thing. But the Fox sisters insisted this was no joke. They developed a system. The spirit would rap once for the letter A, twice for B, 3 times for C, and so on. Slowly, laboriously, the ghost spelled out his story. He had been a travelling peddler. He had been murdered in this very house. His body was buried in the cellar. Word spread. Neighbours came to witness the phenomenon. Local newspapers covered it. Within weeks, the story appeared in the New York Tribune, and from there it exploded across America and leaped the Atlantic to Britain. Within 5 years, thousands of people claimed to be mediums, individuals gifted with the ability to contact the spirit world. Seances became the entertainment of choice for Victorian parlours, and an entire religious movement was born. But why? Why did educated, rational Victorians, people living in an age of scientific advancement and industrial progress, suddenly become obsessed with talking to dead people? Have you ever lost someone so important that you would have done anything, believed anything, just for one more conversation with them? Drop me a comment if you have, because I think that's the key to understanding this whole phenomenon. The Victorians were drowning in death. We've talked about the high mortality rates, the constant presence of loss, the elaborate mourning rituals. But there's another layer here. Faith was in crisis. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, shaking the foundations of biblical literalism. Science was explaining away miracles. The Industrial Revolution had ripped people from rural communities where the church had been the centre of life and dumped them in crowded, anonymous cities. People were losing their religious certainty at precisely the moment when they needed comfort about death the most. Spiritualism offered a solution. It wasn't quite religion. It had no formal theology, no priests, no required rituals. But it wasn't quite science either, though spiritualists desperately tried to frame it as such. It was something in between. Experimental faith. You could investigate the afterlife the way scientists investigated chemistry or geology. You could gather evidence. You could test mediums, attend seances, and collect data about the spirit world. It combined the emotional comfort of religion with the investigative approach of science. It was perfect for the Victorian mindset, and it spread like wildfire. In 1852, just 4 years after the Fox sisters' first seance, an American medium named Maria Hayden arrived in London. She was 26 years old, relatively unknown, but word of her abilities had preceded her. She advertised her services, £1 per sitting, about $50 in today's money, which was expensive but not prohibitively so for the middle classes. Within months, she was the talk of London society. Ladies in silk dresses and gentlemen in top hats crowded into her seances. She demonstrated table rapping, the same technique the Fox sisters had used. Sitters would place their hands on a small table, and the table would lift, tilt, or vibrate as spirits communicated. 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, or the table would tilt toward letters of the alphabet arranged in a circle spelling out messages. The fascination wasn't limited to commoners or the gullible. Queen Victoria herself became deeply involved in spiritualism after the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, turning Windsor Castle into a shrine to his memory. His rooms were kept exactly as he'd left them. His clothes were laid out daily, and she consulted mediums regularly, desperately hoping for contact with him. There's a documented account from 1863 about a séance held at Windsor Castle. A family named Lee, whose 13-year-old son was reportedly a powerful medium, was invited to hold a private sitting for the Queen. During the séance, the boy went into a trance and began speaking in a deep, masculine voice, purportedly Prince Albert's voice. He addressed Victoria by a pet name that only Albert had used. He referenced private conversations and intimate details that no outsider could have known. The Queen was convinced. She hired the Lees' son as her official court medium, and he served in that capacity for 3 decades. Now, was it real? Was this child actually channeling Prince Albert's spirit? Or was it an elaborate performance based on careful research, lucky guesses, and the psychological technique we now call cold reading? We'll never know for certain. But here's what matters. Queen Victoria believed it. The most powerful woman in the British Empire, the ruler of a quarter of the world's population, believed she was speaking to her dead husband through a teenage boy. That tells you everything about how deeply spiritualism had penetrated Victorian culture, and the Queen wasn't alone among the famous and powerful. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, arguably one of the most logical, rational, fictional characters ever written, became a passionate believer in spiritualism later in his life. He wrote books defending it, attended séances religiously, and broke friendships with people who doubted. The great American industrialist Cornelius Vanderbilt consulted mediums before making business decisions. Distinguished scientists joined the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882 to investigate supernatural phenomena using scientific methods. But let's get back to those séances, because they're where things get really interesting. By the 1860s, spiritualism had evolved far beyond simple table rapping. Mediums were competing for clients, and that meant putting on increasingly elaborate shows. The basic format remained consistent. A small group of people, usually 6 to 12, would gather in a darkened room. Darkness was essential. Spiritualists claimed that light disrupted the delicate vibrations of the spirit world. Candles might be allowed, but they'd be covered with red cloth, because red light was supposedly less disruptive to spirits. Everyone would sit around a circular table, circles having mystical significance, and hold hands. This was ostensibly to create a spiritual circuit through which energy could flow, but it also conveniently prevented anyone from using their hands to create fraudulent effects. Or at least that was the theory. The medium would sit at the head of the table and would often begin by leading a prayer or a hymn. Spiritualism wasn't technically Christian, but most Victorian spiritualists still identified as Christians, so biblical references were common. Then the medium would enter a trance state or appear to. Their breathing would change, their eyes might roll back, their voice would deepen or change quality, and they would invite the spirits to manifest. What happened next varied wildly depending on the medium's specialty and theatrical flair. Table turning or table tipping was common. The table would rock, spin, or levitate. Sometimes the movements were subtle, almost imperceptible. Other times the table would practically dance around the room while sitters held on desperately. Scientists who investigated these phenomena suggested that unconscious muscular movements by the sitters themselves could explain it, a phenomenon called the ideomotor effect. But true believers insisted it was genuine spirit activity. Then there were the sounds. Rapping, of course, but also music seemingly coming from nowhere. Phantom trumpets would play melodies. Spirit voices would whisper from dark corners. Mediums specialized in what they called direct voice communication, where spirit spoke through special cone-shaped devices called spirit trumpets or seance trumpets. These were usually made of tin or aluminum, narrow at one end and wide at the other, like a megaphone in reverse. The trumpet would be placed on the seance table or hung from the ceiling. As the seance progressed, sitters would hear sounds emanating from the trumpet, whistles, whispers, sometimes full sentences. Occasionally the trumpet itself would fly through the air in the darkness, propelled by invisible spirit hands. You can imagine the gasps and shrieks that must have accompanied these performances. One of the most famous Victorian mediums was a woman named Florence Cook, born in 1856. She specialized in full-form materializations, actual visible ghosts appearing in the seance room. Her signature spirit was Katie King, supposedly the daughter of a 17th century pirate named John King. During Florence Cook's seances, Katie King would emerge from behind a curtain, draped in flowing white muslin, and interact with sitters. She would touch them, embrace them, even kiss them on the cheek. Katie King would float around the room, her white drapery glowing eerily in the dim light. Florence Cook was investigated by Sir William Crookes, a highly respected chemist and physicist who had discovered the element thallium. Crookes conducted extensive tests and declared Florence Cook genuine. His credibility lent enormous legitimacy to spiritualism. Of course, critics later suggested that Crookes might have been romantically involved with Florence Cook and therefore biased in her favour. And when you look at the evidence, the fact that Katie King bore a suspicious resemblance to Florence Cook herself, that they were never seen in the same space at the same time, that Florence would go into her cabinet supposedly bound hand and foot but emerge afterward with the ropes loosened, well, it seems pretty clear what was happening. But Victorian spiritualists didn't want to see the trick. They wanted to believe in the magic. And that's crucial to understand. Spiritualism wasn't primarily about evidence or proof. It was about hope. It was about the desperate human need to believe that death isn't the end, that our loved ones still exist somewhere, that we'll see them again. When you're grieving, when you're devastated by loss, your critical thinking skills take a backseat to your emotional needs, and the Victorians were grieving constantly. The spiritualist movement also did something quite radical for Victorian society. It empowered women. In an era when women had virtually no power in public life, couldn't vote, couldn't own property if they were married, couldn't enter most professions, mediumship was one of the few careers where women were actually preferred over men. Why? Because Victorian culture associated women with emotionality, intuition, and passivity, all traits supposedly necessary for mediumship. A woman's delicate nature was thought to make her more receptive to spirit communication. A man's rational, active mind was seen as less suitable for surrendering to spirit control. So you had this bizarre situation where women who were told in every other aspect of life that they were weak, inferior, and needed male protection suddenly found themselves at the center of attention, wielding mysterious powers, earning their own money, and being treated with respect and even awe. Some of the most successful mediums became wealthy. They travelled internationally, published books, and gained fame. For Victorian women with limited options, becoming a medium must have been incredibly attractive. Of course, this also meant that male skeptics were often particularly vicious toward female mediums, suggesting that any woman claiming supernatural powers was either hysterical, sexually deviant, or deliberately fraudulent. The misogyny of the era coloured every discussion of spiritualism. By the 1870s and 80s, spiritualism had developed its own infrastructure. There were spiritualist newspapers, the Spiritualist Telegraph, Medium and Daybreak, Two Worlds, Light, publishing accounts of séances, defending mediums against accusations of fraud, and sharing messages supposedly received from the spirit world. There were spiritualist societies and organisations in every major British city. The Spiritualist Association of Great Britain was founded in 1872. These weren't fringe organisations. They had respectable members, formal meeting halls, published proceedings. There were even spiritualist camps, rural retreats where believers could gather for days or weeks of continuous séances, lectures, and spiritual communion. These camps combined the American tradition of religious revival meetings with the British love of organised societies. People would travel from across the country to attend, treating it like a vacation but also a pilgrimage, and the diversity of believers was remarkable. Working-class factory workers sat in séances alongside aristocrats. Scientists participated alongside poets. Radicals and conservatives both found something appealing in spiritualism. It was one of the few Victorian movements that truly crossed class boundaries, at least in the séance room. Though of course wealthy spiritualists could afford more exclusive mediums and fancier accommodations. The movement reached its absolute peak in the 1880s and 90s. By then, an estimated 10 million people worldwide identified as spiritualists or had attended at least one séance. That's a staggering number. To put it in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of London at the time. This wasn't a fringe belief. This was mainstream Victorian culture. But already cracks were appearing. Skeptics were getting organised. Magicians like John Neville Maskelyne and Harry Houdini were exposing fraudulent mediums, showing how tricks could replicate spirit phenomena. The Society for Psychical Research, despite being founded by believers, was accumulating evidence that most mediumship was trickery. And in 1888, the Fox sisters themselves, Margaret and Kate, now middle-aged and battling alcoholism and poverty, publicly confessed that their original spirit wrappings had been fake. They demonstrated how they'd produced the knocking sounds by cracking their toe joints. The foundation of spiritualism was revealed as a hoax. You'd think that would have killed the movement, but it didn't. Because by then, spiritualism had become bigger than the Fox sisters. It had become a way for millions of people to cope with grief, to maintain hope, to feel connected to their lost loved ones. Evidence of fraud among some mediums didn't disprove the existence of genuine spiritual communication, or so believers argued, and grief is remarkably resistant to logic. Spiritualism declined gradually rather than collapsing suddenly. The movement fragmented, with some groups becoming more religious and others more focused on psychic research. But the core practice, séances, mediums, attempts to contact the dead, persisted well into the 20th century and in fact continues today in modified forms. And here's what fascinates me most about Victorian spiritualism. It reveals how badly humans need to believe that death can be overcome. We're so uncomfortable with the finality of death that we'll grasp at any possibility, any hint, any shadow of hope that it might not be the end. The Victorians had their table-tipping seances. We have near-death experience research, ghost hunting shows, mediums on television. The technology changes, but the need remains the same. But seances and table rapping were just the beginning, because the Victorians didn't stop at simple spirit communication. They developed an entire toolkit of supernatural technology, mysterious trumpets, floating faces, something called ectoplasm that looked disturbingly like muslin fabric, and elaborate cabinets from which spirits would emerge in flowing white robes. The theatrical production of the supernatural became an art form in itself, and the equipment involved, well, it was far stranger than anything we've discussed so far. The year is 1873. You're seated in a darkened London parlour, part of a séance that cost you a week's wages. The medium, a dramatic woman with flowing dark hair, has just entered what she calls her spirit cabinet, a tall wooden box draped with black velvet curtains. She's been tied to a chair inside, her hands bound behind her back, her feet lashed to the chair legs. The cabinet's curtain closes. Everyone holds their breath. And then it begins. First, a pale, translucent hand emerges from between the curtains, reaching out toward the sitters. Then another hand. Then a face. Ghostly white. Eyes closed. Features indistinct. Pressing against the fabric as if trying to push through from another dimension. The face withdraws, and suddenly a full figure steps out from the cabinet, draped head to toe in flowing white gauze that seems to glow in the dim candlelight. The figure glides around the room, touches sitters on the shoulder, speaks in whispers, then vanishes back behind the curtain. When the lights come up and the cabinet is opened, the medium is still bound to her chair, apparently unconscious from the effort of spirit materialization. You've just witnessed what the Victorians called a full-form materialization, and you've also just been the victim of one of the most elaborate theatrical hoaxes of the 19th century. But here's the thing, you probably wouldn't have cared. Because the performance was spectacular, the atmosphere was electric, and for a few moments, you genuinely believed you were in the presence of something beyond this world. Welcome to the world of Victorian seance equipment, where spiritualism met stagecraft, where the supernatural was manufactured with tin trumpets and muslin fabric, and where the line between faith and fraud became so blurred that even the mediums themselves sometimes couldn't tell the difference. Let's start with the spirit cabinet, because it's the centerpiece of Victorian materialization seances. The concept was popularized in the 1850s by two American brothers, Ira and William Davenport. Now, the Davenport brothers were fascinating characters because they never actually claimed to be spiritualists. They called themselves magicians and presented their act as entertainment, but they also didn't explicitly say it wasn't real spirit contact. They left the interpretation up to the audience, which was brilliant marketing because it meant both believers and skeptics would pay to see them. Their act went like this. The brothers would enter a large wooden cabinet, basically a tall wardrobe with 3 doors. The audience would tie them up, binding their hands and feet with rope, sometimes even sealing the knots with wax to prevent tampering. The cabinet doors would close and the lights would go out. Immediately, musical instruments placed inside the cabinet would begin playing. Bells would ring, tambourines would shake, hands would reach out from gaps in the doors. Sometimes spirit faces would appear at a small window cut into the cabinet door. The most amazing part? When the lights came back on and the cabinet was opened, the brothers would still be tied exactly as they had been, the knots undisturbed, but the interior of the cabinet would be in complete chaos. Instruments scattered, chairs overturned, evidence of tremendous activity. The implication was clear, spirits had done this. The brothers couldn't have freed themselves, performed all these actions, and retied themselves in the few minutes of darkness. It was impossible. Or was it? Magicians like John Neville Maskelyne later demonstrated that with practice you could slip rope bonds, perform actions quickly in the dark, and slip back into the bonds before the lights came up. But the Davenport brothers never revealed their methods, and Victorian audiences were left to wonder, magic trick or genuine manifestation. The spirit cabinet became standard equipment for materialization mediums. The logic was straightforward. The medium needed to be separated from the sitters to concentrate the spiritual energy. The cabinet provided a kind of supernatural telephone booth where the medium could make the connection to the other side. And conveniently, the cabinet also hid the medium from view, which meant that any suspicious movements, any adjustments to clothing or props, any physical preparation for the manifestation happened out of sight. Because here's what many spirit cabinets actually were: portable dressing rooms. A medium would enter bound and dress normally. Inside the cabinet, they'd quickly slip their bonds — there were dozens of techniques for this — and pull out pre-hidden props: white muslin fabric, gauze masks, luminous paint, fake beards or wigs. They'd drape themselves in the fabric, create the appearance of a spirit, emerge for the dramatic manifestation, then duck back into the cabinet, strip off the costume, stuff it back into hiding places in the cabinet's construction, and slip back into their bonds. The whole process might take 30 seconds if you were skilled, and in a dark room with excited emotional sitters who wanted to believe, it was utterly convincing. But the cabinet was just the beginning. Let's talk about ectoplasm, because this is where things get truly bizarre. Ectoplasm was supposedly a physical substance that emanated from a medium's body during a séance, usually from their mouth, nose, ears, or other orifices. It was described as looking like gauze, muslin, or viscous fluid, and it would materialize during spirit contact, sometimes forming into shapes, faces, or even complete spirit bodies. The word ectoplasm was coined in 1894 by a French researcher named Charles Richet, who combined Greek words meaning exterior and something formed. And almost immediately, ectoplasm became the hot new trend in séances. Mediums who previously had just done table tipping or voice communication suddenly started producing ectoplasm. There are dozens of photographs from the 1890s and early 1900s showing mediums with what looks like white fabric streaming from their mouths or draping over their bodies. Now, let me ask you something. If you look at these photographs today, and you can find them online easily, what do they look like to you? Because to modern eyes, it's pretty obvious. That's not mysterious spiritual substance. That's literally just muslin fabric, sometimes with faces crudely drawn on it with pen or paint, being pulled from hidden pockets in clothing or regurgitated from the mouth after being swallowed earlier. Some mediums used cheesecloth. Others used a substance made from soap, gelatin, and egg white that would foam up and look vaguely supernatural in dim light. The most famous ectoplasm medium was a woman named Helen Duncan, though she was more active in the early 20th century than the Victorian period. She was investigated multiple times, and investigators found that her ectoplasm was made of cheesecloth, egg white, and baby food. But Victorian audiences, primed to believe and viewing these materializations in dim lighting with their emotions running high, saw genuine spiritual phenomena. And here's something you need to understand. Producing ectoplasm wasn't just about stuffing fabric in your mouth. Some mediums went to extreme lengths. There are documented cases of mediums swallowing yards of fine gauze before a séance, then regurgitating it during the spirit manifestation. Imagine the dedication and the discomfort required to pull off that deception, or the desperation. Because these mediums were often earning their living this way, supporting themselves and sometimes their families. The pressure to perform, to produce results, to keep the believers believing must have been enormous. Then there were the spirit trumpets, which we mentioned briefly before. These were cone-shaped devices, usually made of lightweight tin or aluminum, about 2 to 3 feet long, narrow at one end and wide at the other. The narrow end would supposedly amplify the whispered voices of spirits, making them audible to sitters. The trumpet would be placed in the center of the seance table or hung from the ceiling by a thin thread. During the seance, after the medium had entered a trance, the trumpet would begin to move, floating through the air, circling the room, sometimes touching sitters gently on the head or shoulder, and voices would emanate from it, whispers, sometimes full sentences, occasionally entire conversations between multiple spirits. Jonathan Koons, an American spiritualist active in the 1850s, was credited with introducing spirit trumpets to the seance room, though the concept of using horns to amplify sound goes back to ancient times. Victorian mediums embraced them enthusiastically because they solved a practical problem. How do you make spirit voices audible without it being obvious that the medium is just doing voice impressions? Put the voice through a trumpet, move the trumpet around in the darkness so the sound source keeps shifting, and suddenly it's much harder for skeptics to pinpoint where the voice is really coming from. Of course, what was actually happening was that the medium, or sometimes a confederate hidden in the room, was manipulating the trumpet with their hands, or with thin black strings that were invisible in the darkened room. The voices were either the medium doing impressions, or, in some elaborate setups, an accomplice speaking through a tube that connected to the trumpet. But again, in a dark room full of believers, the effect was magical. Let's talk about automatic writing, another popular form of spirit communication. This is where a medium would hold a pen or pencil, fall into a trance, and allow spirits to guide their hand to write messages. The writing would often be in a different style than the medium's normal handwriting, sometimes in a foreign language the medium supposedly didn't know, occasionally written backwards or upside down. Automatic writing was appealing because it produced physical evidence, actual written messages that could be kept and studied. Families would treasure automatic writing supposedly from deceased relatives. The messages tended to be vague, full of platitudes about love and the afterlife, occasionally including a specific detail that would seem to prove the spirit's identity. Modern psychology explains automatic writing through the ideomotor effect, unconscious muscle movements that can produce writing or drawing without conscious awareness. And the foreign languages. Usually they were languages the medium had some exposure to, even if they couldn't speak them fluently. The unconscious mind is remarkably good at retaining fragments of information, but one of the most theatrical elements of Victorian seances was the use of luminous paint and phosphorescent materials. Mediums and their assistants would paint faces, hands, or entire figures with paint containing phosphorus, which glows in the dark after exposure to light. During a seance, these painted props would seem to float in the darkness, glowing with eerie supernatural light. Imagine sitting in a completely dark room. You've been there for 20 minutes, your eyes have adjusted to the darkness. Suddenly, a glowing face appears floating at shoulder height, with hollow eyes and an otherworldly expression. It moves slowly across the room, seems to look directly at you, then fades away. Your heart is pounding, your rational mind is saying, "There's a trick here." But your emotional, instinctive brain is screaming, "Ghost!" That's the power of theatrical manipulation combined with psychological priming. The Victorians had just enough scientific knowledge to create these effects, but not enough widespread understanding of the techniques to immediately recognize them as tricks. Some mediums use confederates, hidden assistants who would emerge during dark seances to play the role of spirits. These accomplices would wear white costumes, speak in whispers, and use the darkness and confusion to move around the room undetected. The famous magician Harry Houdini spent years exposing these frauds in the early 20th century. He would attend seances in disguise, figure out the tricks, and then publicly demonstrate how they were done. He made many enemies in the spiritualist community, but he also saved countless people from financial exploitation by fraudulent mediums. Because let's be clear, while some spiritualists genuinely believed in their gifts and might have convinced themselves they were merely helping the spirits manifest, many mediums were running deliberate confidence schemes. They charged significant fees. Remember, Maria Hayden charged a guinea per séance, which was substantial, and they manipulated grieving, vulnerable people. Some mediums would research their clients beforehand, learning details about deceased family members from obituaries, from servants, from social gossip. Then they'd present these details during the séance as proof of spirit contact. It was cold reading combined with advanced preparation, and it was cruel. But here's the complicated part. Even when frauds were exposed, even when the tricks were revealed, believers often continued to believe. They'd rationalize, well, maybe that medium was fake, but others are genuine. Or maybe the medium needs to fake it sometimes when the spirits aren't cooperating, but the core phenomenon is real. Or simply, I know what I experienced and no explanation can take that away from me. This psychological resilience of belief in the face of contrary evidence tells us something important about human nature. We don't believe things primarily because of evidence. We believe things because they fulfill emotional needs, because they fit our worldview, because the people we trust believe them, because giving up the belief would be too painful. The Victorians needed to believe the dead could communicate with them, so they continued to believe even when the evidence suggested otherwise. And you know what? I'm not entirely unsympathetic. If someone you loved desperately had died, and a medium told you they had a message from that person, and the message contained something that felt real, that felt true, that brought you comfort, would you immediately reject it? Or would you allow yourself to believe, at least for a little while, because the alternative, accepting the absolute finality of death, is just too hard? The Victorian séance room, with all its cabinets and trumpets and ectoplasm and theatrical trickery, wasn't really about fooling people. It was about creating a space where people felt permission to hope, permission to believe, permission to feel that death wasn't the end. The equipment, the darkness, the rituals, they weren't the point. They were the scaffolding that supported the emotional experience that people desperately needed. And that emotional need, that desperate hope that we can somehow maintain connection with those we've lost, didn't end with the Victorian era. Still with us today, just wearing different costumes. We have mediums on television, ghost hunting shows with electromagnetic field detectors and infrared cameras, spiritualist churches that continue the tradition, and millions of people who believe, or want to believe, that death is not the final goodbye. But while the Victorians were busy trying to invite the dead to come visit them, they also lived in constant fear of attracting the wrong kind of supernatural attention. Because not all supernatural beliefs were about comfort and connection. Some were about protection and danger. Some were about the evil eye, about malevolent spirits, about curses that could destroy you with nothing more than a glance. And the methods the Victorians used to protect themselves from these spiritual attacks, well, they involved bottles of urine, pins, and hiding them in the walls of your house. There's a small town in Somerset called Glastonbury, famous today for its music festival and a New Age spirituality. But in the 1830s, Glastonbury was famous for something quite different. It was a place where people genuinely believed that certain individuals could kill you with nothing more than a malevolent look. They called it overlooking, and if you were unlucky enough to be overlooked by someone with the power, your fate was considered sealed. You would waste away, become depressed and hollow, lose all interest in life, and within months, sometimes weeks, you would die. Not from poison, not from disease, from a glance. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't about hurt feelings or psychological harm. The Victorians in places like Glastonbury believed that some people possessed the evil eye, and that their gaze could literally drain your life force, curse your crops, sicken your livestock, and destroy your health. And the only way to save yourself was to find a conjurer, a kind of magical practitioner who could break the curse before it killed you. Have you ever felt like someone's stare was making you uncomfortable? Like you could feel their eyes on you, and it made your skin crawl? That universal human experience of being watched is at the root of evil eye beliefs. But the Victorians took it to an extreme that's hard for us to fathom today. They didn't just feel uncomfortable, they felt endangered. And they organised their entire lives around avoiding and combating this invisible threat. The concept of the evil eye is ancient, stretching back thousands of years to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and ancient Greece. But it survived robustly into the Victorian era, especially in rural areas where older folk beliefs held stronger than in the cities. The basic idea was this: some people were born with a potent eye, a gaze that carried malevolence whether they intended it or not. Sometimes these were people known to be angry, vengeful, or jealous. Other times they were perfectly ordinary people who happened to have unusual eyes, perhaps different coloured eyes, or a particularly intense stare, or eyes that never seemed to blink quite normally. When such a person looked at you with ill intent, through anger, revenge, or malignity, they could overlook you, and once you'd been overlooked, the symptoms were specific and terrifying. A person who had been overlooked would become, in the words of one 1830s account, sunk in spirits, wasted in strength and form, inattentive to their concerns and connections, and totally absorbed in the dreadful idea that unless the withering witchery could be overcome, inevitable ruin and certain death must speedily be their doom. Think about that description. Sunk in spirits, wasted in strength and form. That sounds remarkably like what we would now recognise as severe depression, possibly combined with a wasting illness, or even the psychological component of what we'd call a psychosomatic condition. But to the Victorians, this wasn't a medical or psychological issue. It was witchcraft pure and simple. And here's the truly frightening part. If you believed you'd been overlooked, that belief itself could kill you. There are documented cases of people who became convinced they were cursed, stopped eating, stopped caring for themselves, essentially gave up on life, and died within months. The power of belief, of expectation, of cultural context, it can have real physical effects. We call this the nocebo effect now, the dark twin of the placebo effect. If you believe something will harm you, your body can actually manifest those symptoms. One Victorian observer tried to convince those who claimed to be overlooked that their beliefs were utterly insensible, completely without sense. But he found that rational arguments had no effect whatsoever. The only solution was to call in what they called a conjurer, a local magical practitioner who specialised in breaking curses. Otherwise, the observer noted, the overlooked person would become victims of their own deluded imagination. But was it delusion, or was it culturally constructed reality? In a community where everyone believes in the evil eye, where the symptoms of being overlooked are well known and expected, where social mechanisms exist to diagnose and treat it, the evil eye becomes functionally real. It's not that there's actual magical energy coming from someone's eyes, it's that the entire social system operates as if there is, and individual psychology adapts to match collective belief. The evil eye wasn't unique to Glastonbury or even to Britain. It was, and is, one of the most widespread superstitions in human history. The Greeks called it Marti. The Italians call it Malocchio. In Turkey it's Nazar. The concept exists in Jewish tradition, in Islamic tradition, in Hindu tradition, across vast swaths of human culture. Across thousands of years, people have believed that a malevolent gaze can cause harm. Why? What is it about eyes and looking that taps into such deep human fear? Eyes are powerful. They're how we gather most of our information about the world. They're crucial for social communication. We read emotions in eyes, determine trustworthiness, establish dominance or submission. Eyes feel vulnerable too. We automatically blink to protect them. We get uncomfortable when people stare too long or too intensely. And eyes are uncanny. They can look without touching, affect from a distance, violate boundaries in ways that are hard to define or defend against. So it makes a kind of evolutionary sense that humans might be primed to fear hostile gazes. What the Victorians did was take that primal instinct and build an entire supernatural framework around it. Now, if the evil eye was the threat, protection against it became a major concern. And this is where things get really interesting from an archaeological and historical perspective. Because the Victorians, and the people who came before them, left physical evidence of their attempts to ward off malevolent spiritual influences. Hundreds, actually thousands of protective objects have been found hidden in the walls, under the floors, in the chimneys, and in the foundations of old houses across Britain. The most common of these objects are witch bottles. Over 200 witch bottles have been discovered in Britain, and that's almost certainly just a fraction of how many were originally hidden. These bottles, usually made of stoneware or glass, were filled with a bizarre mixture. The homeowner's urine, bent pins or nails, pieces of hair or fingernail clippings, sometimes threads from clothing, occasionally small sharp objects like thorns or glass shards. The logic behind witch bottles is grimly fascinating. The bottle was supposed to attract any curse or evil magic directed at the household. The urine and personal items created a magical link to the intended victim. The sharp objects, the pins and nails, were meant to cause pain to the witch or whoever had cast the evil eye. In theory, when a witch tried to curse you, the curse would be drawn to the bottle instead, and the witch would feel the pain of the pins piercing them. This would either break the curse or discourage the witch from continuing the attack. One Victorian folklorist described the belief, "Evil could be fended off with a mixture of urine and hair." It sounds absurd to modern ears, but remember, these were people who didn't understand germ theory, who had no concept of viruses or bacteria, who saw disease and misfortune as supernatural in origin. If you believe that curses are real and that they can be redirected, a witch bottle makes perfect sense as spiritual technology. The fascinating thing is how recently these objects were still being made. You might think witch bottles are medieval, but they were being created well into the 1800s. They've been found in houses built in the Victorian era, hidden during construction or renovation. This wasn't ancient history, this was contemporary practice. And witch bottles weren't the only protective magic hidden in houses. Dried cats, actual mummified cats, have been found sealed in walls under floors between roof timbers. These are believed to have been protective talismans, though the exact reasoning is debated. Cats were associated with witches, so perhaps having a cat, even a dead one, in your walls would attract or trap malevolent magic. Or perhaps cats were seen as hunters of vermin, and placing them in walls would symbolically hunt spiritual vermin, evil spirits and curses. Over the years, more than 300 concealed cats have been discovered in British buildings. When renovators find them, they're often disturbed and confused, not realizing they've discovered evidence of centuries-old magical practice. Some people think they've discovered something sinister, evidence of animal cruelty or dark rituals, but in context, these were protective charms meant to keep the household safe from supernatural harm. Shoes, especially children's shoes, were also commonly concealed. Hundreds of old shoes have been found hidden in chimneys, under floorboards, in wall cavities. These weren't shoes that were simply lost or discarded. They were deliberately placed as protective magic. The reasoning seems to be that a worn shoe carries the essence of the person who wore it, particularly their vitality and life force. Children's shoes were especially powerful because children were seen as innocent and pure, so their symbolic protection was strongest. If you're doing renovation work on an old house in Britain and you find a Victorian child's shoe in the wall, congratulations. You've discovered concealed protective magic. Please don't throw it away. Archaeologists and folklorists would love to study it. Then there were horse skulls deliberately buried under floors or placed in foundations. The skull's hollow eye sockets and grinning teeth were thought to frighten evil spirits. Plus, in life, horses were powerful, fast, and associated with both travel and agricultural wealth. Symbolically, they offered protection and prosperity. The variety of protective magic is stunning. Salt lines across doorways, which we mentioned earlier, iron horseshoes nailed above doors, iron being a traditional protection against fairies and malevolent spirits. Rowan trees planted near houses, specific plants hung in bundles, red thread tied around children's wrists, silver coins buried at thresholds. Each region had its variations, its preferred methods, its local experts who could advise on proper protective procedures. What strikes me most about all of this is the level of fear it represents. These weren't simple good luck charms, these were serious attempts to defend against perceived supernatural attacks. People were filling bottles with their own urine and hiding them in walls. They were sealing dead cats into their homes. They were pulling out their own hair and mixing it with pins. This took effort. This took commitment. And it tells us that the fear of the evil eye, of curses, of malevolent spiritual forces, was absolutely genuine and deeply felt. And we shouldn't be too quick to mock, because even in our supposedly rational modern world, evil eye beliefs persist. Go to Greece or Turkey, and you'll see blue eye amulets everywhere, on bracelets hanging in cars over doorways. In Mediterranean and Middle Eastern communities around the world, people still take precautions against the evil eye. It's not that people literally believe energy beams shoot from eyes, it's that the symbolic framework of envy, jealousy, and malevolent attention causing harm still resonates. We've just moved from "their gaze cursed me" to "their negativity affected me," but the underlying belief structure is remarkably similar. And honestly, the Victorian understanding that belief itself can sicken or kill, that's not superstition, that's psychology. The nocebo effect is real. Stress, depression, the feeling of being cursed or doomed, these absolutely can impact physical health. The Victorians were right that belief has power. They were just wrong about the mechanism. So when we look at those witch bottles filled with urine and pins, when we see those mummified cats in walls, those children's shoes in chimneys, we're not just looking at quaint superstitions, we're looking at evidence of genuine fear, genuine attempts to protect loved ones from perceived threats, and genuine faith in the power of symbolic action. They were doing the best they could with the understanding they had. And honestly, I find that rather touching. But protective magic against the evil eye wasn't the only daily supernatural concern Victorians dealt with, because beyond curses and malevolent gazes, there were omens everywhere. Simple, everyday actions that could accidentally summon death to your door. Opening an umbrella indoors, putting shoes on a table, walking under a ladder. The Victorian home was absolutely riddled with potential death traps, invisible tripwires that could bring disaster with one careless movement. And the rules governing these omens were elaborate, specific, and, if you weren't careful, deadly. You've just come home from a rainy walk through Victorian London. Your boots are muddy, so you sit down to remove them, and without thinking, you place them on the kitchen table while you fetch a cloth to clean them. Your grandmother, who's been visiting, lets out a shriek of horror. She rushes over, snatches the boots off the table, and places them firmly on the floor, all while muttering prayers under her breath. You laugh it off, they're just boots, what's the harm? But your grandmother looks at you with genuine fear in her eyes and says, "You've just invited death into this house. Someone in this family will be hanged before the year is out." This is not an exaggeration of Victorian belief. This is exactly how seriously they took these domestic omens. Putting shoes or boots on a table wasn't just bad luck, it was a specific death omen, and the death it predicted wasn't peaceful old age. It was hanging, execution, the most shameful death imaginable in Victorian society. And it all stemmed from one grim historical detail. When a person was hanged in Britain, Their shoes were traditionally placed on a table as part of the preparation of the body for burial. So by putting your boots on the table, even innocently, even practically, you were symbolically reenacting an execution ritual. You were performing the gesture of death. And in a culture where symbols held tremendous power, where actions carried weight beyond their physical reality, this was genuinely terrifying. How many of you have been told not to put shoes on the table? Maybe your parents or grandparents scolded you for it. Did they explain why, or was it just we don't do that? Drop a comment if this was a rule in your house, because I guarantee you, somewhere in your family history, someone believed this superstition deeply enough that it became an unbreakable household law even after the supernatural explanation was forgotten. The Victorian home was absolutely filled with these invisible rules, these everyday actions that could supposedly summon death. And unlike the dramatic rituals we've discussed, seances, witch bottles, spirit cabinets, these were simple mundane mistakes you could make without even realizing. That's what made them so insidious. You couldn't avoid witches if you lived in the countryside. You couldn't completely prevent the evil eye, but you absolutely could avoid putting shoes on tables, opening umbrellas indoors, or walking under ladders. These dangers were preventable, which meant if death came, it was your own careless fault. Let's talk about umbrellas, because this one is still with us today. In Victorian times, opening an umbrella indoors wasn't just considered unlucky. It was believed to predict or even cause a murder in your family. Not an accident, not a natural death. A murder. Specifically, a murder of someone in your household. The reasoning behind this superstition has several layers. First, umbrellas were associated with the outdoors, with weather, with the public sphere. To open one indoors was to blur the boundary between outside and inside, between the safe domestic space and the dangerous world beyond. In a way, you were inviting the chaos and violence of the outside world into your protected home. Second, the shape of an open umbrella was considered symbolically dangerous. Some believed it represented the shade of death. Umbrellas provided shade from the sun, and death was referred to metaphorically as the final shade. To open an umbrella indoors was to spread the shade of death over your household. Third, and perhaps most practically, Victorian umbrellas were large, unwieldy objects with sharp metal spokes and points. Opening one indoors actually was somewhat dangerous. You could poke someone's eye out, knock over a lamp, cause a fire. So there was a legitimate safety concern that got dressed up in supernatural language. Telling children, "Don't open umbrellas indoors or someone will be murdered," was much more effective than "Don't open umbrellas indoors because you might break something." But the Victorians genuinely believed the supernatural explanation. There are documented cases of families who experienced a violent death after someone had opened an umbrella indoors months earlier, and that action was cited as the obvious cause. The umbrella had invited death in, and death had come calling right on schedule. Then there's walking under ladders, which remains one of the most persistent superstitions in modern Western culture. How many of you will walk around a ladder rather than under it, even though you don't really believe anything bad will happen? I bet quite a few of you. The superstition is that old, that ingrained. The Victorian explanation for this one was theological. A ladder leaning against a wall forms a triangle, and the triangle represents the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. To walk through that triangle is to break the Trinity, to violate sacred geometry, to commit a kind of casual blasphemy. And breaking the Trinity meant inviting evil into your life, disrupting divine protection, potentially bringing death. There's also a more practical origin. Walking under a ladder is actually somewhat dangerous. Something might fall on you, a paint bucket, a tool, the person on the ladder themselves. But again, the Victorians wrapped the practical danger in supernatural significance, making it about more than just safety. It was about spiritual consequences. Crossed knives were another household danger. If two knives accidentally fell across each other on a table, forming an X shape, it was considered an omen of death or at minimum a serious argument. The crossed knives formed a symbol of conflict, of cutting, of violence. Some believed the crossed knives represented swords crossed in battle. Others saw them as a trap for souls, a spiritual snare. Whatever the interpretation, the solution was immediate. You had to separate the knives quickly, uncross them, and some people would then touch wood or make the sign of the cross to ward off the evil. Breaking a mirror, which we touched on briefly earlier, was famously bad luck. But let me give you the full Victorian understanding. 7 years of bad luck specifically. Why 7? Because the Victorians believed the human body completely renewed itself every 7 years. Every cell, every bit of tissue was replaced in a 7-year cycle. So if you broke a mirror, which reflected your soul, remember, you had damaged your soul's image, and it would take a full regeneration cycle, 7 years, for your soul to heal. 7 years is a long time to suffer bad luck. That's a powerful deterrent against careless handling of mirrors, which were expensive objects in Victorian times. Again, we see practical concerns, don't break expensive things, encoded in supernatural language that made the prohibition more compelling. Single snowdrops growing in a garden were considered extremely unlucky, omens of death. Snowdrops are those delicate white flowers that bloom in late winter, often pushing through snow, which is why they're called snowdrops. They're beautiful, hardy little flowers. But to Victorians, they symbolize death. Why? Because they're white, the colour of shrouds and mourning. Because they bloom alone, isolated like a person dying solitary. And most directly because they bloom in graveyards and cemeteries associated with the dead. If a single snowdrop appeared in your garden, not a cluster, not a group, but one solitary flower, it was believed that someone in your household would die soon. Some families would refuse to bring cut snowdrops indoors under any circumstances. Others would dig up any snowdrop that appeared unbidden in their garden, trying to prevent the omen from manifesting. Sparrows landing on pianos were another specific and oddly particular death omen. If a sparrow, a common garden bird, flew into your house and landed on your piano, someone in the family would die. Why pianos specifically? Pianos were expensive status symbols in Victorian homes, often positioned in the parlour, the heart of family life. They represented domestic harmony, musical culture, genteel living. A wild bird invading that space and touching that symbol of civilization was considered a profound disruption, a sign that death was about to disrupt the family's harmony. Owls hooting, especially during daytime, were terrible omens. Owls are nocturnal, so an owl active during the day was already unnatural. And owls were associated with death in European folklore going back centuries. They're silent hunters. They're creatures of darkness. Their calls sound mournful. A daytime owl was considered a messenger of death, actively announcing that someone nearby. Birds in general featured heavily in death omens. A bird flying down the chimney was considered a death announcement. The chimney was the house's throat, its connection to the outside air, and a bird entering through it was like death forcing its way in. Dogs howling outside the house where someone lay sick was another death omen. The dog could supposedly see the approach of death that humans couldn't perceive. Even clocks stopping spontaneously, not during a death but at random, was considered ominous. We talked earlier about deliberately stopping clocks when someone died. But a clock stopping on its own was thought to mark the moment when fate sealed someone's doom. The universe was recording the moment of future death, and the clock was its instrument. The sheer number of these omens is overwhelming. Every Victorian household would have known dozens of them, and here's what's psychologically fascinating. These omens were self-perpetuating. If you broke a mirror, you expected 7 years of bad luck. And for the next 7 years, Every time something unfortunate happened, a business failure, an illness, an accident, you'd remember the broken mirror and think, aha, there's the bad luck. Meanwhile, you'd forget all the bad things that happened before the mirror broke, and you'd discount the good things that happened after. The omen became a lens through which you interpreted all subsequent events. This is called confirmation bias, and the Victorians were masters of it, though they didn't have the terminology to recognize what they were doing. Once you believed in an omen, you looked for evidence that confirmed it and ignored evidence that contradicted it. And in a time when life was genuinely precarious, when disease and accident and financial ruin could strike at any moment, there was always plenty of misfortune to attribute to whatever omen you'd recently triggered. But here's something we need to acknowledge. These superstitions, as frustrating as they might seem to us, served psychological functions. They gave people a sense of control in an unpredictable world. If you could avoid death by simply not putting shoes on tables, by walking around ladders, by being careful with mirrors, then death became something you could influence through your actions. It wasn't random, it wasn't arbitrary, it was governed by rules, and you could learn and follow those rules. That's deeply comforting in its own way. The alternative, accepting that terrible things happen randomly, that no amount of caution can guarantee safety, that death comes for everyone regardless of their actions, is psychologically very difficult. The Victorians chose magical thinking over existential despair, and honestly, I can't entirely blame them. These superstitions also reinforced careful behaviour. Don't put shoes on tables, because tables are for food and shoes are dirty. Don't open umbrellas indoors, because you might hurt someone or break something. Don't walk under ladders, because something might fall on you. The supernatural consequences made people more cautious, more mindful, more careful in their daily actions. The superstitions were functional, even if the explanations were fantastical. And many of these superstitions survive today, stripped of their original meanings, but still powerful as social norms. We don't believe opening an umbrella indoors will cause murder, but many of us still feel uncomfortable doing it. We don't believe walking under ladders breaks the Holy Trinity, but we'll cross the street to avoid it. The actions persist even after the beliefs have faded. That's how deeply these Victorian superstitions embedded themselves in Western culture. They became habits, reflexes, things we do without understanding why. So the next time someone tells you not to do something for seemingly no reason, don't put your purse on the floor, don't toast with water, don't give someone a knife as a gift without receiving a penny in return, remember that you're probably hearing an echo of Victorian supernatural thinking. These rules have been passed down through generations, often without explanation, becoming "that's just what we do" instead of "we do this to prevent death." The supernatural terror has faded, but the behavioural prohibition remains. But all these everyday omens, all these domestic death traps were individual concerns, things that would affect you and your immediate family. The Victorians had another category of superstitions entirely, ones that govern their relationship with the natural world around them, particularly with creatures they shared their lives with. And none of these relationships was more important or more carefully maintained with ritual and superstition than their relationship with bees. Because if you didn't tell the bees when someone died, well, the consequences could be catastrophic. Your father has just died. The funeral is being planned, mourning clothes are being ordered, the minister is being contacted. But before any of that can proceed properly, there's something urgent you must do first. You walk out to the garden where the beehives stand and you knock 3 times on each hive with the house key. Then, speaking clearly and respectfully, you say, little bees, your master has died, but you must stay with us and continue to thrive." You drape each hive with a piece of black mourning fabric, the same material being used for the funeral. And later, when the funeral tea is served to human guests, you carefully set out portions of every single item: cake, bread, tea, even the clay pipes provided for smoking on a small table near the hives. Because the bees must be included in the funeral, they must be told, they must be fed. If you fail in this duty, the bees will die, or fly away, or stop producing honey. And then everyone will know that you brought this calamity on yourself through neglect of the ancient customs. This practice was called telling the bees, and it was taken absolutely seriously across rural Britain well into the Victorian era and even beyond. It wasn't considered quaint or charming, it was considered essential. These weren't just insects, these were members of the household, and they had rights to information and inclusion that had to be respected, or else. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. This is adorable. How sweet that they included the bees in family events. And yes, there's something touching about it. But before we get too sentimental, remember, this wasn't done out of cuteness. This was done out of fear. The Victorians genuinely believed that failing to tell the bees would result in disaster. The bees represented life, prosperity, the sweetness of existence. Disrespecting them meant inviting poverty and death. The origins of this custom stretch back centuries before the Victorian era, deep into European folklore. Bees have always held a special place in human mythology. They're industrious, organized, seemingly intelligent. They produce honey, one of the few sources of sweetness available before widespread sugar cultivation. They're essential for pollination, though the Victorians didn't fully understand that scientific relationship, and they have a quality that made them seem almost supernatural. They appear to communicate with each other, to work in perfect harmony, to operate as a single collective consciousness. In European folklore, bees were believed to be messengers between this world and the next. Some traditions held that bees were the souls of the dead temporarily inhabiting the mortal world before moving on. Others believed that bees could carry messages to the departed, that they travelled between realms. This is why they had to be told about deaths, births, marriages, and other major family events. They needed to stay informed about the family's status so they could continue their role as intermediaries. The ritual of telling the bees had specific rules that varied slightly by region but shared common elements. You had to approach the hives respectfully, as you would approach an elder or a person of importance. Some families insisted it had to be the head of the household who told the bees, or the person who normally tended them. Others said it could be anyone, but it had to be done sincerely and with proper respect. You would knock on the hive, usually 3 times, because 3 is a powerful number in European folklore and Christianity. The knocking was to get the bees' attention, to make sure they were listening. Then you would speak to them. Some people used formal language. "Mr. Bees, I have to inform you that the master of the house has passed away." Others spoke more familiarly. "Little bees, sad news. John has died." The exact words mattered less than the intention and the act of communication itself. Then came the mourning drape. Each hive would be covered with black fabric, just as mirrors in the house were covered. The bees were being brought into the household mourning, made participants in the grief. Some families would remove the black fabric after the funeral. Others would leave it for a full mourning period, sometimes months. But here's where the custom gets really interesting. The funeral tea for the bees. After the human funeral, when guests returned to the house for refreshments, and Victorian funerals always included substantial food and drink, a portion of everything served had to be set out for the bees. Not near the hives exactly, but on a small table or platform positioned where the bees could access it if they chose. This might include slices of funeral cake, pieces of bread, even small amounts of the alcoholic drinks being served, and yes, clay pipes. The Victorians commonly provided clay pipes and tobacco at funerals for guests to smoke. This was considered hospitable and comforting. So a pipe would be laid out for the bees too, not because anyone expected bees to smoke, but because they had to be offered everything the human guests received. Equality of treatment was crucial. One Victorian folklorist documented this practice in detail, noting that the bees were given a portion of every item served at the funeral tea, right down to the clay pipes. The image of a tiny pipe laid out for bees would be comical if the practitioners weren't so deadly serious about it. Why this elaborate inclusion? The explanation goes back to that belief about bees as souls of the dead. By including the bees in the funeral feast, you are including the dead themselves, or at least the representatives of the dead. You are acknowledging that death and life are intertwined, that the departed are still part of the family in some sense, that the boundary between living and dead is permeable. It's actually quite a profound spiritual concept expressed through the practical medium of beekeeping. There's also an element of reciprocity here. Bees provide honey, wax for candles, and pollination services, though again the Victorians didn't fully grasp the pollination aspect. The family benefits from the bees' labour, so in return the family has obligations to the bees. You can't just take from them without giving back. This is an ancient principle found across many cultures. The obligation of exchange, the importance of reciprocity in maintaining relationships, whether those relationships are with humans, animals, or the natural world. Failing to tell the bees, or failing to treat them properly during the telling, would result in the bees leaving, dying, or becoming sullen and refusing to produce honey. The bees would variously die, fly away, or refuse to work according to different traditions. All of these outcomes were economic disasters for a Victorian household. Honey was valuable. Beeswax was essential for candles and other purposes. Losing your bees meant losing a significant source of income and household resources. So again, we see practical concerns wrapped in supernatural language. The ritual of telling the bees ensured that someone checked on the hives regularly, that the bees were treated with care and respect, that their needs weren't neglected even during times of family crisis. A family dealing with death might forget to tend the bees, but if you believed the bees had to be told and included, you'd remember. The superstition functioned as a memory aid, a way of encoding important practical knowledge in ritual form. But telling the bees wasn't just about deaths. Bees had to be informed of births, marriages, any major change in the household. If a daughter married and left home, the bees needed to know. If a new baby was born, the bees needed to be introduced. Some families would bring the newborn baby out to the hives and formally present them. Bees, this is Thomas, the new member of our family. The bees had to be kept up to date on the household roster. And it wasn't just information sharing. There were also rules about how you could treat bees. You couldn't sell bees for money. That was considered deeply unlucky. You could give them as gifts or trade them for goods, but accepting cash payment for bees would anger them and bring misfortune. Bees were too sacred, too connected to the spiritual realm to be reduced to mere commodities. If you had to move your bees to a new location, some traditions insisted you had to move them on Good Friday, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, or at midnight on certain feast days. Moving them at the wrong time would confuse and upset them, and you had to tell them where they were going and why. Bees, we're moving you to the south garden because there are more flowers there. Communication was everything. Now, let's talk about another Victorian funeral custom that's related to this idea of reciprocity with the dead: sin eating. This practice is less common than telling the bees, and it was controversial even in Victorian times, but it's absolutely fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. A sin eater was a person, usually a poor man from the community, who would be hired to come to a house where someone had died. The deceased's body would be laid out and food and drink would be placed on the chest of the corpse. The sin eater would then consume this food and drink, and by doing so he would literally eat the sins of the deceased person, taking those sins upon himself and allowing the dead person's soul to go to heaven unburdened. Think about what this means. The sin eater was selling his own soul's salvation for money. He was deliberately taking on spiritual pollution, damnation even, so that someone else could go to heaven. It's an incredibly dark transaction, and it was practiced in parts of rural Wales, the Welsh borders, and occasionally in England, including into the Victorian period. One documented account from Derbyshire describes a farmer explaining the practice. "We drink to wash away the dead person's sins, thus helping them to reach heaven quicker." This is a slightly different version, communal sin-eating through drinking rather than a designated sin-eater. But the principle is the same. The living take on spiritual burden to help the dead. This practice has deep roots in Catholic funeral mass traditions, specifically the idea of praying for the dead, of offering masses to speed a soul through purgatory. When England became Protestant and rejected the idea of purgatory and prayers for the dead, these folk practices emerged as a kind of underground continuation of the same impulse. People still wanted to help their dead relatives reach heaven, but now they had to do it through unofficial, folkloric means rather than through church rituals. Victorian folklorists were fascinated and appalled by sin-eating in equal measure. They documented it carefully, but they also condemned it as barbaric superstition. The practice was dying out by the mid-Victorian era, but the fact that it existed at all tells us something important about Victorian spiritual anxiety. They were terrified of death, yes, but they were also terrified of what came after death. Salvation wasn't guaranteed. Heaven and hell were real, immediate concerns, and people would do almost anything, including hiring someone to damn themselves on your behalf, to secure a better afterlife. The funeral biscuit tradition was related to sin-eating but less extreme. Special biscuits would be baked for funerals, sometimes with moulds that stamped symbols into them: skulls, hourglasses, angels. These funeral biscuits would be distributed to attendees, who would eat them in remembrance of the deceased. This was socially acceptable, even fashionable among certain classes. But it carried echoes of the older, darker practice of sin-eating. The idea that consuming food associated with the dead created a connection, a transfer of some spiritual quality. And speaking of children and superstitions, there was the deeply unsettling belief that if a baby didn't cry when christened, it was too good for this world and would die young. The reasoning was that crying showed spirit, fight, engagement with earthly life. A silent baby was already halfway to heaven, too pure and angelic to survive in this harsh world. So parents would actually hope their babies would scream during baptism, seeing those cries as a promising sign of earthly attachment. Then there was the belief about cow parsley, a common wildflower, that Victorian children were taught never to pick. It was called mother dye in children's folklore because picking it would cause your mother to die. Can you imagine being a child and believing that? Seeing a pretty white flower and knowing that if you picked it, you'd kill your mother. That's a powerful deterrent against picking wildflowers, certainly, but it's also psychologically harsh. Victorian children grew up surrounded by these invisible dangers, these actions that could bring death to themselves or their loved ones. The cumulative effect of all these beliefs, the bees that must be told, the sins that must be eaten, the flowers that kill mothers, the babies too good for this world, was a culture absolutely saturated with awareness of death and the supernatural. Every action had potential consequences that extended into the spiritual realm. You couldn't just live your life. You had to navigate a complex web of ritual obligations, supernatural dangers, and spiritual responsibilities. But here's what's remarkable. People managed. They learned the rules, they followed the customs, they told the bees and avoided the cow parsley and hoped their babies cried at christening. These superstitions were woven so deeply into daily life that they became second nature. You didn't have to consciously think about them most of the time. They were just part of how you lived, as automatic as saying bless you when someone sneezes is for us today. And some of these practices, believe it or not, continue. Beekeeping families in rural Britain sometimes still tell the bees when someone dies. not because they believe the bees will leave necessarily, but because it's what we've always done and it feels wrong not to. The supernatural explanation has faded, but the ritual persists as tradition, as connection to the past, as a way of marking important moments. That's the power of these Victorian superstitions. They weren't just beliefs, they were practices, rituals, actions that created meaning and connection. And even when we stop believing the supernatural rationale, we sometimes keep the ritual because the ritual itself has value. It makes us pause, reflect, acknowledge change. Telling the bees becomes a moment to process grief, to stand in the garden and speak your loss aloud. That has psychological benefit regardless of whether you think the bees are listening. But while the Victorians were carefully maintaining their relationship with bees and worrying about sin-eaters and cow parsley, they were also doing something that might seem even stranger to modern eyes. They were hiding things in their walls. Not witch bottles this time, though those too. They were concealing children's worn shoes in chimneys. They were sealing coins under thresholds. They were burying horse skulls under floors. And these objects, these deliberate concealments, they're still being discovered today, puzzling renovation workers and delighting archaeologists. The question is, what were they trying to protect themselves from, and did it work? You're renovating an old Victorian house in the English countryside. The builders have just pulled up the floorboards in the upstairs bedroom, and one of them calls you over urgently. There, nestled in the cavity beneath the floor, perfectly preserved by the dry conditions, is a tiny leather shoe. It's clearly a child's shoe, worn down at the heel, the leather creased from use. But it's not just lost, it's been deliberately placed there, hidden, during construction, positioned carefully in the space between the floor joists. And as you look closer, you realize there's something else beside it. A clay pipe, a few buttons, what looks like a small piece of fabric. The builder looks at you, confused and slightly disturbed. "Should we call the police?" he asks. "Is this evidence of something bad?" No, what you've discovered isn't evidence of a crime. It's evidence of hope, evidence of fear, evidence of parents who love their children so much that they hid these objects in the walls, believing with absolute conviction that doing so would protect their family from evil spirits, from witchcraft, from the malevolent forces they believed surrounded their home. You've just found a piece of Victorian protective magic, and archaeologists would be thrilled to study it. This practice of concealing objects in buildings, particularly children's worn shoes, was widespread across Britain during the Victorian era and for centuries before. We're not talking about a few isolated cases, we're talking about thousands of documented finds. The Deliberately Concealed Garments Project, run by researchers at the University of Northampton, has catalogued over 2,000 concealed shoes found in buildings across the United Kingdom alone, and those are just the ones that have been reported. How many more remain hidden, undiscovered, still doing their supernatural job of protection? Have any of you ever found something strange during home renovation? Maybe an old bottle, an unusual object that didn't make sense? Drop a comment, because you might have discovered concealed protective magic without realizing it. And if you're planning renovations on an old house, keep your eyes open. You might be about to make an archaeological discovery. So why shoes? Why specifically children's shoes? The reasoning goes back to a belief that personal objects, especially clothing and shoes, absorb the essence of the person who wears them. A shoe molds itself to the wearer's foot. It carries their sweat, their skin cells, their unique shape. In a very real sense, it becomes part of them. The Victorians believed this absorption went deeper than the physical. They believed a worn shoe captured something of the wearer's life force, their vitality, their spiritual presence. Children's shoes were particularly powerful because children represented innocence, purity, new life. A child's essence was uncorrupted, making it the perfect protection against corruption, against evil spirits and malevolent magic. So by hiding a child's worn shoe in the walls of your house, you were essentially embedding protective vitality into the structure itself. The house would be watched over by the innocent spirit imprinted on that shoe. The shoes weren't new, they were always worn, sometimes heavily worn. This was crucial. A new shoe had no essence, no connection to a person, but a shoe that had been walked in for months or years, that showed the marks of the child's gait, the way they distributed their weight, the particular wear pattern of their activities. That shoe was saturated with their presence. That's what made it powerful. The locations where shoes were hidden were also significant. They were almost always placed in what we might call liminal spaces, thresholds, boundaries, transitional areas, under the floorboards near doorways, in chimneys, which were the house's connection to the outside world through the roof, in wall cavities near windows, behind the hearth where the fire burned, the home's symbolic heart. These were the places where evil spirits might try to enter, so these were the places that needed the strongest protection. Chimneys were surely popular hiding spots, and for good reason. In folklore, witches and evil spirits were believed to enter houses through chimneys, the same way Santa Claus supposedly does, interestingly enough. The chimney was a vulnerability, an opening in the house's protective shell. So placing a protective object in the chimney would block or deter supernatural intruders. But shoes weren't the only things being hidden. The variety of concealed objects is absolutely fascinating. Dried cats, which we mentioned before, were found in walls, under floors, between roof timbers. These mummified cats, and yes, they are real cats, naturally preserved or deliberately dried, number in the hundreds across British buildings. The exact purpose is debated, but cats were associated with both witchcraft and the hunting of vermin. They might have been protective talismans, or they might have been symbolic hunters of spiritual evil, or both. Horse skulls were buried under floors or placed in foundations. Over 100 documented cases exist. Horses were powerful, valuable animals associated with speed, strength, and agricultural prosperity. Their skulls, with those large empty eye sockets and prominent teeth, might have been considered frightening to evil spirits. Or the skull might have been a sacrifice, an offering to ensure the building's stability and success. Archaeological evidence suggests this practice was particularly common in northern England and Scotland. Then there were witch bottles, those containers of urine, pins, and personal materials we discussed earlier. But beyond those, people also concealed more mundane objects that had symbolic significance. Clay pipes, coins, pieces of fabric, written prayers or Bible verses, small bottles with mysterious contents, even garments like gloves, stockings, or caps. Some objects seem to have been concealed for good luck rather than protection from evil. Coins under thresholds were meant to bring prosperity to the household. You were literally building wealth into the foundation of your home. Written prayers or Bible verses were straightforward spiritual protection, divine words to ward off demonic influences. These would be written on paper or parchment and sealed into walls or tucked into roof spaces. What's remarkable is that this practice crossed class boundaries. You find concealed objects in wealthy manors and in poor cottages. You find them in churches, in public buildings, in private homes. This wasn't aristocratic eccentricity or peasant superstition. This was widespread cultural practice that everyone, regardless of social status, participated in to some degree. And the practice was secret, or at least private. These objects were hidden during construction or renovation, when walls were open and floors were up. They were placed where they wouldn't be seen or disturbed under normal circumstances. The builders, the homeowners, the people doing the concealing, they didn't advertise what they were doing. This was quiet, personal magic done without fanfare, meant to work invisibly in the background of daily life. This secrecy is part of why we're still discovering these objects today. They were meant to stay hidden, to keep working their protective magic indefinitely. So when renovations happen, when old buildings are modified or demolished, suddenly these time capsules are revealed. Workers find them and often don't know what they are. Sometimes they're thrown away before anyone realizes their historical significance, which is a tragedy for archaeologists and folklorists. If you do find one, if you're renovating and you discover a concealed shoe, a mysterious bottle, a dried cat, anything that seems deliberately hidden and inexplicable, please don't throw it away. Contact your local museum or university archaeology department, or the Deliberately Concealed Garments Project if you're in Britain. These objects are pieces of social history, evidence of how our ancestors thought and what they feared, and how they tried to protect their loved ones. Some people who discover these objects face a dilemma. Should they leave them in place or remove them? Some believe that removing protective magic will bring bad luck to the house, even in our modern age. Others want to preserve them as historical artifacts. There's no perfect answer, but many archaeologists recommend documenting the object thoroughly, photographing it in situ, recording its exact location, noting what else was found nearby, and then consulting with experts about whether to remove it or leave it in place. The psychological power of these concealed objects shouldn't be underestimated. When you build something, a house especially, you're creating a space where you and your family will live, where children will grow, where meals will be shared, where life will happen. That's profound. And the Victorian builder or homeowner who tucked a child's shoe into the wall cavity wasn't being foolish or superstitious in some dismissive sense. They were doing everything they could with the knowledge and beliefs they had to ensure that space would be safe, blessed, protected. It's a very human impulse. We still do similar things, actually. We have housewarming parties where we bring gifts to new homes. Some people bury St. Joseph statues in their yards to help sell their houses. We hang horseshoes over doors for good luck. We put wreaths on our doors at Christmas, which has pagan protection symbolism beneath the Christian holiday decoration. The form changes, but the impulse to make our homes safe, to invite good fortune, to ward off harm, that impulse is the same. And here's something beautiful that sometimes happens when people discover these concealed objects, especially shoes. They sometimes feel a connection to the long-ago parent who hid them. They imagine a mother or father holding their child's outgrown shoe, hoping this small act might keep their family safe. Across the centuries, that hope, that love, that fear, it's all still there, preserved in the object. It's time travel through empathy. The Boston subway incident from 1897 adds another fascinating dimension to this. When Boston opened its first subway system on September 1st, 1897, many Massachusetts residents were genuinely afraid to ride it. Not because of safety concerns about the technology, but because travelling underground meant going closer to the devil. The Earth's depths were associated with hell, and deliberately descending underground felt spiritually dangerous to people raised on these supernatural beliefs. This shows how persistent and powerful these Victorian superstitions were. Even in a major American city at the end of the 19th century, with electric lights and modern engineering, people were still deeply influenced by ancient beliefs about sacred and profane spaces, about where evil lived and how to avoid it. The concealed objects tell us that Victorian homes weren't just physical structures. They were spiritual fortresses, built not only with bricks and timber, but with ritual, with hope, with protective magic. Every threshold was a potential breach. Every opening, chimney, window, door was a vulnerability. So they defended those spaces with every tool they had: children's shoes carrying innocent vitality, cats to hunt spiritual vermin, horseshoes to frighten evil, bottles to trap curses, coins to ensure prosperity. Living in a Victorian house meant living surrounded by invisible protections you might not even know about. Hidden in the walls, under the floors, in the roof spaces, these objects work their magic silently. And in a way they still are. They're still there, most of them, still tucked into the structures of old buildings across Britain and beyond, still carrying the hope of long-dead parents, still embodying the belief that love can protect, that small acts can have cosmic significance, that we're not helpless in the face of evil. That's deeply moving to me. It's also a reminder that our ancestors weren't ignorant or foolish. They were doing their best in a world that genuinely was more dangerous than ours, where disease could kill in days, where fire could destroy homes in minutes, where poverty was always one bad harvest away. They couldn't control most of those dangers, but they could hide a shoe in the wall. They could perform a ritual that made them feel less helpless, and maybe, in the doing, they actually did protect something, not from supernatural evil, but from despair, from the crushing weight of powerlessness. But all this talk of protection and evil spirits and hidden magic, it might make you think the Victorians lived in constant fear, that their lives were grim and paranoid. But that's not the complete picture, because alongside all these death omens and protective rituals, the Victorians also had superstitions about joy, about new beginnings, about hope for the future. And nowhere were these more elaborate, more joyful, more surprisingly silly than in their wedding traditions. Because if you thought hiding shoes in walls was strange, wait until you hear what brides had to wear, what they threw at newlyweds, and what it meant if a spider crawled on your wedding dress. It's your wedding morning. You're standing in your bedroom in your undergarments, about to put on your beautiful white wedding dress, the one you've been planning for months, and then you see it. A small spider crawling across the bodice of your gown. Your bridesmaid shrieks and moves to brush it away, but your mother stops her, grabs her hand and says firmly, "Don't you dare! That spider is the best wedding present she could possibly receive. She'll never want for money in her marriage." In Victorian Britain, a spider on your wedding dress was considered spectacularly good luck, the absolute best omen a bride could hope for. Not just any good luck, but specifically financial security, prosperity, wealth throughout the marriage. So if you saw a spider making its way across your expensive silk and lace, you didn't scream, you didn't brush it away, you smiled, you said a little thank you to the universe, and you let it finish its journey before carefully removing it. That spider was more valuable than any wedding gift. Now, how many of you would be happy to see a spider on your wedding dress? Be honest, I'm guessing most of you would be less than thrilled. But that's because we've lost the context, the belief system that made that spider a welcome guest rather than a terrifying intruder. The Victorians saw spiders as symbols of industry, of careful weaving, of creating something beautiful from simple threads, all metaphors for a successful marriage and household management. A spider's web represented the interconnected nature of family and fortune. So a spider blessing your dress meant your marriage would be similarly industrious, interconnected, and ultimately profitable. Victorian wedding superstitions were a fascinating mix of hope and anxiety, joy and terror. On one hand, weddings were celebrations of love and new beginnings. On the other hand, they were dangerous transition points, moments when you moved from one state to another, which made you vulnerable to supernatural interference. So every aspect of the wedding had to be carefully managed to ensure good luck and ward off evil. Let's start with the bride's attire, because the famous saying, "something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue," comes directly from Victorian wedding tradition. But do you know what each item actually meant? Because there's real symbolism here, carefully thought out. Something old represented continuity with the past, connection to your family and ancestry. Often this was a piece of jewellery from a grandmother or mother, or a bit of lace from an older relative's wedding dress. You were carrying your family's blessings and history into your new marriage. You weren't severing ties with your birth family, you were extending them. Something new symbolized optimism for the future, the fresh start you were making. This was usually the wedding dress itself, or new shoes or new gloves. It represented hope that this new phase of life would be positive and prosperous. Something borrowed was supposed to come from a happily married woman. And this is crucial. You weren't just borrowing any object, you were borrowing a token from a marriage that was successful, loving, stable. The belief was that some of that marital happiness would transfer to you through the borrowed item. It was like a good luck charm charged with proof that happy marriages were possible. Often this was a handkerchief or a piece of jewellery, and something blue. This one has deeper roots than you might think. Blue was the colour of the Virgin Mary, symbolising purity, fidelity and loyalty. But it was also believed to confuse evil spirits. Many cultures believed that evil spirits were attracted to white and to virginity, so they'd try to harm brides dressed in white. But blue would confuse them, make the bride harder to find or target. So wearing something blue was protective magic disguised as decorative tradition. Some brides would wear a blue ribbon or blue garter hidden under their dress. Others would have blue embroidery on their undergarments. The point was to have blue somewhere on your person, even if no one else could see it. The magic worked whether it was visible or not, but the rhyme actually has a less-known continuation, and a silver sixpence in her shoe. The bride was supposed to put a silver coin in her left shoe for the ceremony. Why? For prosperity, obviously, but also for balance. The coin would be uncomfortable, causing a slight limp, which would remind the bride to enter her marriage humbly rather than proudly. A little discomfort on your wedding day meant you'd remember that marriage requires patience and wouldn't always be comfortable. The wedding dress colour itself was loaded with meaning. White, which we now consider traditional for weddings, actually became popular during the Victorian era, largely because Queen Victoria wore a white wedding dress when she married Prince Albert in 1840. Before that, brides wore their best dress in whatever colour they could afford. But Victoria's choice started a fashion that became a tradition. However, there were strong superstitions about other colours. There was an old rhyme: "Married in white, you have chosen right. Married in blue, love ever true. Married in pink, your spirits will sink. Married in green, ashamed to be seen. Married in red, you'll wish yourself dead. Married in yellow, ashamed of your fellow. Married in black, you'll wish yourself back. Married in grey, you'll go far away." These weren't just cute verses, these were genuine beliefs that influenced brides' choices. Green was particularly unlucky because it was the colour of fairies, and fairies were jealous creatures who would curse any bride who wore their colour. Red was scandalous, suggesting the bride was unchaste. Black was for mourning, not marriage. Yellow suggested cowardice or infidelity. Rain on your wedding day is still something modern brides worry about. But the Victorian interpretation was actually positive. Blessed is the bride the sun shines on, but happy is the bride that the rain falls on. Rain was considered good luck because it symbolized fertility, abundance, cleansing. A rainy wedding day meant your marriage would be blessed with children and prosperity. The bride who got rained on was washing away her old life and being baptized into her new one. Of course, this might have been a case of making the best of British weather. If you live in a place where it rains frequently, you'd better have a superstition that makes rain lucky, or you'd never have a happy wedding. Birds played a significant role in wedding omens. If a robin sang on the wedding morning, it was an omen of joy and happiness. Robins were considered cheerful, bright birds, and their song was a blessing. Doves at the wedding were also auspicious. They represented peace, love, fidelity, because doves mate for life. This is why releasing doves at weddings became popular, and why dove imagery still decorates wedding invitations. But certain birds were terrible omens. If a crow or raven appeared on the wedding day, it predicted sorrow and possibly early death. Magpies required counting, the rhyme, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy. On a wedding day, the number of magpies you saw would predict your marital future. One magpie was disastrous. You'd have to search frantically for a second one to balance it out. Wedding guests would throw rice, grain, or birdseed at the couple as they left the church. This practice continues today, though we often use confetti instead. But the original purpose was fertility magic. Rice, grain, and seeds represented abundance, growth, multiplication. By throwing them at the couple, you were symbolically showering them with the power of fertility, ensuring they'd have many children. The more enthusiastically you threw, the more children the couple would supposedly have. Some traditions specified wheat rather than rice because wheat was a staple crop, representing sustenance and survival. A marriage showered with wheat would never starve, would always have enough. The symbolism was practical as well as magical. There was also a superstition about the bride's path to the church. She should take one route to the ceremony and a different route back home afterward. Taking the same path both ways was considered unlucky, like retracing your steps, suggesting you'd undo the marriage or return to your old single state. The different paths symbolized that you were a different person after marriage. You weren't going back to who you were before. Wedding cakes were thick with superstition. The bride and groom had to cut the first slice together, with the groom's hand over the bride's, symbolizing their unity and his support of her. Single women would take a slice of wedding cake home and put it under their pillows that night, believing they'd dream of their future husbands. This practice was so common that many Victorian cookbooks included special recipes for dreaming cake that would keep for days without going stale. Bouquets had meaning too. The flowers the bride chose weren't just decorative. Each flower had symbolic significance. Orange blossoms represented fertility and purity. Roses meant love, obviously, but the colour mattered. Red for passion, white for innocence, pink for happiness. Ivy symbolized fidelity and eternal love because it clings and doesn't let go. Myrtle represented a happy marriage and was often included because it was said to have been in Queen Victoria's bouquet. But certain flowers were absolutely forbidden at weddings. Lilies, particularly white lilies, were for funerals, not weddings. They represented death and mourning. Bringing lilies to a wedding was like inviting death to the marriage. Yellow carnations represented disdain or disappointment, and red and white flowers together in a bouquet were considered ominous, representing blood and bandages, predicting accident or injury. The groom had superstitions to follow too. He absolutely could not see the bride in her wedding dress before the ceremony. This wasn't just about romantic suspense or tradition. It was believed that if the grooms saw the bride beforehand, one of them would die before the first anniversary. The pre-wedding separation kept the bride and groom safe from this curse. The reasoning had to do with evil spirits again. Evil spirits were most active right before major life transitions, trying to disrupt them. By keeping the couple separated before the ceremony, you denied the evil spirits a target. They couldn't strike both members of the couple if the couple wasn't together. Dropping the wedding ring during the ceremony was catastrophic. It meant the marriage was cursed, that one partner would be unfaithful, or that the marriage would be unhappy. If the ring was dropped, some traditions required the ceremony to start over from the beginning, or required the couple to have the ring blessed by a priest before continuing. And there were superstitions about wedding gifts too. You should never give knives, scissors, or any sharp objects as wedding gifts because they represented severing, cutting, separation. If someone did give you knives as a gift, you had to immediately give them a penny in return. The penny transformed the gift into a purchase, breaking the curse. This superstition is still observed by some people today. Here's an interesting one. Absently rocking an empty cradle meant a baby was on the way. So at wedding receptions, if there happened to be a cradle present, perhaps because the wedding was in someone's home, unmarried women would avoid it, but newlyweds might deliberately rock it, inviting fertility. Month of marriage mattered enormously. There was a detailed rhyme: marry when the year is new, always loving, kind and true. When February birds do mate, you may wed, nor dread your fate. If you wed when March winds blow, joy and sorrow, both you'll know. Marry in April when you can, joy for maiden and for man. Marry in the month of May, you will surely rue the day. Marry when June roses blow, over land and sea you'll go. They who in July do wed must labour always for their bread. Whoever wed in August be, many a change are sure to see. Marry in September's shine, your living will be rich and fine. If in October you do marry, love will come but riches tarry. If you wed in bleak November, only joy will come, remember. When December's showers fall fast, marry and your love will last. May was the absolute worst month to marry. Marry in May, rue the day was a warning taken very seriously. May was the month of Beltane, an ancient pagan festival, and was considered unlucky for Christian weddings. It was also the month when Romans honoured their dead, so it was associated with ghosts and mourning. June became the most popular wedding month partly because it came right after May. It was the first safe month to marry after winter ended. All these superstitions, the spiders and the rain, the borrowed blue items and the rice throwing, the flower meanings and the forbidden months, they transformed weddings into elaborate rituals of protection and hope. The Victorians were trying to ensure through symbol and ceremony what they couldn't guarantee through law or social structure, that the marriage would be happy, prosperous, fertile and lasting. And you know what? Many of these traditions continue. We still have something old, new, borrowed and blue. We still throw rice or bird seed. We still have the groom avoid seeing the bride beforehand. The supernatural explanation has faded, but the ritual persists because rituals give structure to our emotions. They make important moments feel more significant, more sacred. But weddings were about beginnings, about hope for the future. The final category of Victorian superstitions we need to explore is different. It's about desperation, about when hope runs thin and you need something more direct than omens and good luck charms. It's about folk medicine, about healing rituals that blur the line between medical treatment and magical intervention. And some of these practices, well, they involved passing sick children through split trees at dawn, and that's just the beginning. The year is 1833. A newspaper correspondent in rural England has been invited to witness a ceremony that most educated city dwellers would consider barbaric superstition. A young child, perhaps 3 years old, suffering from rickets, a disease that softens and weakens the bones, is being carried by his mother through the early morning mist to a very specific tree. It's an ash tree, and someone has deliberately split the trunk, creating a narrow vertical opening just wide enough for a small body to pass through. The mother, following instructions from the local wise woman, will pass her child through this split in the tree 3 times. She'll do it at dawn because dawn is a liminal time, neither night nor day, when magic is strongest. She'll pass him through 3 times because 3 is the most powerful number in folk magic and Christian tradition. And she'll use an ash tree because ash has protective and healing properties that go back to pagan times, long before Christianity came to Britain. After the 3rd passage, the split in the tree will be bound tightly with rope or cloth, forcing it to grow back together. The belief is this: as the tree heals itself, closing the split, the child's bones will also strengthen and heal. The child's illness has been transferred to the tree, or perhaps the tree's vitality has been transferred to the child. Either way, the healing will happen, or so the mother desperately hopes. This is folk medicine, Victorian style, and it was practiced widely, documented repeatedly, and believed absolutely by people who had no other options when modern medicine failed, which in the Victorian era was often. The power of 3 runs through almost every aspect of Victorian folk magic and superstition. We've seen it again and again throughout this journey. Knock on the beehive 3 times, pass the child through the tree 3 times, stop the clock at 3 past the hour. Why 3? Because 3 represents the Holy Trinity in Christianity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 3 is completion, perfection, sacred geometry. But the power of 3 goes deeper than Christianity. It's found in pagan traditions, in fairy tales, in folk magic across cultures. 3 wishes, 3 sisters, 3 trials. The human mind seems drawn to 3s, to patterns that repeat 3 times. In Victorian folk healing, almost every ritual had to be repeated 3 times to work. You'd say a healing prayer 3 times. You'd circle a patient's bed 3 times. You'd apply an herbal poultice for 3 consecutive nights. The number wasn't arbitrary, it was essential. Do something twice and the magic wouldn't take. Do it 4 times and you'd ruin it. 3 was the key. The cleft ash tree ceremony for rickets was witnessed and documented multiple times in the early Victorian era. It wasn't a single isolated incident. It was widespread practice across rural Britain. And here's what's interesting. Sometimes it seemed to work. Not because trees have magical healing properties, but because rickets is caused by vitamin D deficiency, and the ceremony required families to bring their children outdoors at dawn. Exposure to early morning sunlight, even weak sunlight, would help the child's body produce vitamin D. Add to that the psychological boost of believing you were being healed, the placebo effect, and some children probably did show improvement. The Victorians didn't understand the mechanism, but they observed the correlation. Take your child through the cleft ash tree ritual, and sometimes they get better. So the practice continued, passed down from generation to generation, because it worked often enough to be worth trying. But ash trees weren't just for rickets. Ash wood was considered powerfully proactive against evil. Some families would keep ash leaves in their homes or wear them as charms. There was a saying, "An ash tree in your garden keeps evil at bay." The ash was sacred to pre-Christian peoples of northern Europe. The world tree in Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, was an ash. So using ash for healing was drawing on centuries, maybe millennia, of accumulated belief and symbolic power. Other folk healing practices were equally elaborate. Planting a leek somewhere in the house was believed to prevent the house from catching fire. This seems random until you remember that leeks are associated with Wales, with Saint David, with protection, and a living plant in the house represented life force, vitality, resistance to destruction. Whether it actually prevented fires is doubtful, but it probably made people more cautious about fire safety, which functionally achieved the same goal. Washing clothes on Good Friday was absolutely forbidden. Good Friday was the day Christ died, the most solemn day of the Christian year. Doing ordinary work, especially washing, was considered deeply disrespectful and would bring terrible luck, possibly death, to your household. This prohibition was taken so seriously that even poor families who desperately needed to do laundry would wait until Saturday rather than risk washing on Good Friday. But here's the thing. This prohibition also gave women a mandatory day of rest. In an era where working-class women laboured constantly, where there was always washing to do, always cleaning, always cooking, the Good Friday prohibition provided a socially acceptable excuse to stop. You couldn't work because it was superstition, because it was sacred, because it would bring disaster. So even if you wanted to work, you couldn't. The superstition functioned as a labour protection law, a guarantee of rest day even if that wasn't the stated purpose. Hot cross buns, those sweet spiced buns marked with a cross that are still eaten at Easter, were part of Good Friday tradition. but baking them on Good Friday for good luck was considered by some Victorian reformers to be undoubtedly a relic of superstition and ought to be abolished. The fact that they are still eaten today suggests the abolitionists lost that battle. Sometimes superstition is more powerful than rational reform. Touching wood for luck is a superstition that remains incredibly strong even today. A 2003 survey in Britain found that 74% of respondents believed in touching wood, and a 2007 poll found that 51% actually practiced it regularly. These numbers are remarkable. More than half of modern Britons engage in a practice that stems directly from Victorian superstition, from the belief that wood, particularly oak, which was sacred to Druids and pre-Christian peoples, contained protective spirits or divine essence. When you touch wood, you're appealing to those protective forces, or you're grounding yourself in the natural world, or you're simply following a ritual that makes you feel safer. The Victorian explanation was that you were literally touching the true cross, the wood on which Christ died, invoking divine protection. But the practice is older than Christianity, rooted in tree worship that goes back to when Britain was covered in ancient forests and trees were seen as homes of spirits. Crossing your fingers for good luck is another practice that survived from Victorian times. 39% of Britons in that 2007 poll admitted to crossing their fingers regularly. The gesture supposedly forms a secret cross, invoking Christian protection. Or it represents two people joining forces, combining their luck. Either way, it's a tiny piece of Victorian magical thinking that we perform unconsciously dozens of times in our lives. The number 13, which we discussed extensively earlier, was considered unlucky by 15% of respondents in that survey. That might not sound like a lot, but in a country of millions, that's a substantial number of people actively avoiding the 13th floor, not wanting 13 at dinner, feeling genuine unease around that number. The superstition is weakening, but far from dead. And 16% of Britons carried lucky charms. That's 1 in 6 people walking around with a rabbit's foot, a 4-leaf clover, a special coin, or some other object they believe brings good fortune. The form of the charm may have changed, but the impulse is pure Victorian superstition. Invest an object with power, carry it with you, let it protect you from harm. What's fascinating about all of this is the persistence. The Victorian era ended in 1901 when Queen Victoria died. We've had more than a century of scientific advancement since then. We've split the atom, sequenced the human genome, landed on the moon, created computers that fit in our pockets. We know more about how the universe works than the Victorians could have dreamed. And yet, we still throw salt over our shoulders, avoid walking under ladders, touch wood, cross our fingers, feel uncomfortable about the number 13. Why? Because superstitions aren't really about the supernatural. They're about control, comfort, connection. When you throw salt over your shoulder, you're not really trying to blind Satan. You're performing a ritual that makes you feel like you've done something, like you have agency in an uncertain world. When you touch wood, you're not invoking tree spirits. You're engaging in a shared cultural practice that connects you to centuries of people who did the same thing. Superstitions are habits of hope. They're small actions that make us feel less helpless. And the Victorians, living in an age of tremendous change and uncertainty, needed those habits desperately. Death was everywhere. Disease could strike without warning. The old certainties of rural life were being destroyed by industrialization. Religious faith was being challenged by science. People needed something to hold on to, some sense that they weren't completely powerless. So they told the bees, covered the mirrors, threw salt, hid shoes in walls, avoided the number 13, blessed their marriages with spiders and rain, passed sick children through split trees, and touched wood whenever they felt afraid. These weren't signs of ignorance. These were signs of humanity. of people doing everything they could with the knowledge and tools they had to protect the people they loved and make sense of a chaotic world. And here's what I find most beautiful about Victorian superstitions. They acknowledge that life is uncertain, that bad things happen, that we can't control everything, but they refuse to accept complete helplessness. Yes, death comes for everyone eventually. Yes, disease and misfortune are part of human experience, but you can still drape your hives in black, still tell your bees, still knock 3 times and speak the words. You can still act with intention, with hope, with love. That's what all these superstitions were at their core, acts of love. Parents hiding their children's shoes to protect them. Families covering mirrors to help the dead find peace. Brides carrying something borrowed from a happy marriage. Communities throwing rice to bless a new union. Mothers carrying sick children to ash trees at dawn, hoping desperately for healing. Every superstition, every ritual, every seemingly silly belief, they were all attempts to say, I care, I'm trying, I refuse to give up. We might not believe in the supernatural explanations anymore. We might laugh at the idea that bees need to be informed of deaths or that umbrellas cause murder. But we shouldn't laugh at the love behind those beliefs, at the hope, at the refusal to accept powerlessness. Those Victorian ancestors of ours were doing their absolute best in a world that was genuinely more dangerous, more unpredictable, more saturated with death than anything we experience today. And if some of their superstitions have survived into our modern age, if we still feel compelled to touch wood or throw salt or avoid the number 13, even though we know it's just superstition, well, maybe that's okay. Maybe those small rituals connect us to our past, remind us that we're part of a long chain of humans who all struggled with the same fears, the same hopes, the same desire to protect what we love. The Victorians lived in the shadow of death, but they filled that shadow with candles, tiny lights of ritual and belief that pushed back the darkness just enough to keep living, keep loving, keep hoping. And perhaps in our own way, in our own time, we're still lighting those same candles. So the next time you throw salt over your shoulder or touch wood or make a wish at 11:11 or avoid a black cat or feel nervous about Friday the 13th, remember you're part of a tradition that goes back centuries. You're connected to countless people who perform that same gesture, seeking that same comfort. The Victorians would understand exactly what you're doing and they'd approve. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Victorian superstitions. We've explored mirrors and clocks, 13 at dinner, photographers capturing death, salt and Satan, seances and ectoplasm, the evil eye, everyday omens, telling the bees, hidden shoes in walls, wedding traditions and folk healing. We've travelled from the deeply spiritual to the wonderfully silly, from the tragic to the touching. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into how our ancestors thought and lived and loved. If you enjoyed this series, please do share it with someone who loves history or strange facts or stories about how wonderfully weird humans can be. Leave a comment about which superstition surprised you most or which one you still practice yourself. And most importantly, subscribe, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more fascinating corners of history to explore. Together, until next time, touch wood, tell your bees, and may you always find something borrowed and blue when you need it. Sweet dreams, everyone, and thank you for listening.